Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, we open the pages of one of the most enchanting tales ever told. But before we begin, if these quiet stories bring you peace, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. I'd truly love to know where you're listening from and what hour of the night finds you here. Our little circle now stretches across oceans, bound by stories and calm. So dim the lights, let the air grow still, and let your mind wander gently with me into tonight's story. The Little Mermaid. Far out in the ocean, where the water is as blue as the prettiest cornflower and as clear as crystal, it is very, very deep. So deep, indeed, that no cable could fathom it. Many church steeples, piled one upon another, would not reach from the ground beneath to the surface of the water above. There dwell the Sea King and his subjects. We must not imagine that there is nothing at the bottom of the sea but bare yellow sand. No, indeed. The most singular flowers and plants grow there, the leaves and stems of which are so pliant that the slightest agitation of the water causes them to stir as if they had life. Fishes, both large and small, glide between the branches, as birds fly among the trees here upon land. In the deepest spot of all stands the castle of the Sea King. Its walls are built of coral, and the long Gothic windows are of the clearest amber. The roof is formed of shells that open and close as the water flows over them. Their appearance is very beautiful, for in each lies a glittering pearl, which would be fit for the diadem of a queen. The Sea King had been a widower for many years, and his aged mother kept house for him. She was a very wise woman, and exceedingly proud of her high birth. On that account, she wore 12 oysters on her tail, while others, also of high rank, were only allowed to wear 6. She was, however, deserving of very great praise, especially for her care of the little sea princesses, her granddaughters. They were 6 beautiful children, but the youngest was the prettiest of them all. Her skin was as clear and delicate as a rose leaf, and her eyes as blue as the deepest sea. But like all the others, she had no feet, and her body ended in a fish's tail. All day long they played in the great halls of the castle, or among the living flowers that grew out of the walls. The large amber windows were open, and the fish swam in, just as the swallows fly into our houses when we open the windows, excepting that the fishes swam up to the princesses, ate out of their hands, and allowed themselves to be stroked. Outside the castle there was a beautiful garden in which grew bright red and dark blue flowers and blossoms like flames of fire. The fruit glittered like gold, and the leaves and stems waved to and fro continually. The earth itself was the finest sand, but blue as the flame of burning sulfur. Over everything lay a peculiar blue radiance, as if it were surrounded by the air from above, through which the blue sky shone instead of the dark depths of the sea. In calm weather the sun could be seen, looking like a purple flower, with the light streaming from the calyx. Each of the young princesses had a little plot of ground in the garden, where she might dig and plant as she pleased. One arranged her flower bed into the form of a whale. Another thought it better to make hers like the figure of a little mermaid. But that of the youngest was round like the sun, and contained flowers as red as his rays at sunset. She was a strange child, quiet and thoughtful, and while her sisters would be delighted with the wonderful things which they obtained from the wrecks of vessels, she cared for nothing but her pretty red flowers. Like the sun, excepting a beautiful marble statue. It was the representation of a handsome boy, carved out of pure white stone, which had fallen to the bottom of the sea from a wreck. She planted by the statue a rose-colored weeping willow. It grew splendidly, and very soon hung its fresh branches over the statue, almost down to the blue sands. The shadow had a violet tint and waved to and fro like the branches. It seemed as if the crown of the tree and the root were at play and trying to kiss each other. Nothing gave her so much pleasure as to hear about the world above the sea. She made her old grandmother tell her all she knew of the ships and of the towns, the people and the animals. To her, it seemed most wonderful and beautiful to hear that the flowers of the land should have fragrance, and not those below the sea, that the trees of the forest should be green, and that the fishes among the trees could sing so sweetly that it was quite a pleasure to hear them. Her grandmother called the little birds fishes, or she would not have understood her, for she had never seen birds. "When you have reached your 15th year," said the grandmother, "you will have permission to rise up out of the sea, to sit on the rocks in the moonlight, while the great ships are sailing by. And then you will see both forests and towns." In the following year, one of the sisters would be 15, but as each was a year younger than the other, the youngest would have to wait 5 years before her turn came to rise up from the bottom of the ocean and see the earth as we do. However, each promised to tell the others what she saw on her first visit and what she thought the most beautiful, for their grandmother could not tell them enough. There were so many things on which they wanted information. None of them longed so much for her turn to come as the youngest, she who had the longest time to wait and who was so quiet and thoughtful. Many nights she stood by the open window, looking up through the dark blue water and watching the fish as they splashed about with their fins and tails. She could see the moon and stars shining faintly, but through the water they looked larger than they do to our eyes. When something like a black cloud passed between her and them, she knew that it was either a whale swimming over her head or a ship full of human beings, who never imagined that a pretty little mermaid was standing beneath them, holding out her white hands towards the keel of their ship. As soon as the eldest was 15, she was allowed to rise to the surface of the ocean. When she came back, she had hundreds of things to talk about, but the most beautiful, she said, was to lie in the moonlight, on a sandbank in the quiet sea near the coast, and to gaze on a large town nearby, where the lights were twinkling like hundreds of stars, to listen to the sounds of the music, the noise of carriages, and the voices of human beings, and then to hear the merry bells peal out from the church steeples. And because she could not go near to all those wonderful things, she longed for them more than ever. Oh, did not the youngest sister listen eagerly to all these descriptions? And afterwards, when she stood at the open window looking up through the dark blue water, she thought of the great city with all its bustle and noise, and even fancied she could hear the sound of the church bells down in the depths of the sea. In another year, the second sister received permission to rise to the surface of the water and to swim about where she pleased. She rose just as the sun was setting, and this, she said, was the most beautiful sight of all. The whole sky looked like gold, while violet and rose-colored clouds, which she could not describe, floated over her. And still more rapidly than the clouds flew a large flock of wild swans towards the setting sun, looking like a long white veil across the sea. She also swam towards the sun, but it sunk into the waves, and the rosy tints faded from the clouds and from the sea. The third sister's turn followed. She was the boldest of them all, and she swam up a broad river that emptied itself into the sea. On the banks, she saw green hills covered with beautiful vines. Palaces and castles peeped out from amid the proud trees of the forest. She heard the birds singing, and the rays of the sun were so powerful that she was obliged often to dive down under the water to cool her burning face. In a narrow creek, she found a whole troop of little human children, quite naked and sporting about in the water. She wanted to play with them, but they fled in a great fright. And then a little black animal came to the water. It was a dog, but she did not know that, for she had never before seen one. This animal barked at her so terribly that she became frightened and rushed back to the open sea. But she said she should never forget the beautiful forest, the green hills, and the pretty little children who could swim in the water, although they had not fishes' tails. The fourth sister was more timid. She remained in the midst of the sea, but she said it was quite as beautiful there as nearer the land. She could see for so many miles around her, and the sky above looked like a bell of glass. She had seen the ships, but at such a great distance that they looked like seagulls. The dolphins sported in the waves, and the great whales spouted water from their nostrils till it seemed as if 100 fountains were playing in every direction. The fifth sister's birthday occurred in the winter, so when her turn came, she saw what the others had not seen the first time they went up. The sea looked quite green, and large icebergs were floating about, each like a pearl, she said, but larger and loftier than the churches built by men. They were of the most singular shapes and glittered like diamonds. She had seated herself upon one of the largest and let the wind play with her long hair, and she remarked that all the ships sailed by rapidly and steered as far away as they could from the iceberg, as if they were afraid of it. Towards evening, as the sun went down, dark clouds covered the sky, the thunder rolled and the lightning flashed, and the red light glowed on the icebergs as they rocked and tossed on the heaving sea. On all the ships, the sails were reefed with fear and trembling, while she sat calmly on the floating iceberg, watching the blue lightning as it darted its forked flashes into the sea. When first the sisters had permission to rise to the surface, they were each delighted with the new and beautiful sights they saw. But now, as grown-up girls, they could go when they pleased, and they had become indifferent about it. They wished themselves back again in the water, and after a month had passed, they said it was much more beautiful down below, and pleasanter to be at home. Yet often, in the evening hours, the 5 sisters would twine their arms round each other and rise to the surface in a row. They had more beautiful voices than any human being could have, and before the approach of a storm, and when they expected a ship would be lost, they swam before the vessel and sang sweetly of the delights to be found in the depths of the sea, and begging the sailors not to fear if they sank to the bottom. But the sailors could not understand the song. They took it for the howling of the storm, and these things were never to be beautiful for them, for if the ship sank, the men were drowned, and their dead bodies alone reached the palace of the Sea King. When the sisters rose, arm in arm, through the water in this way, their youngest sister would stand quite alone, looking after them, ready to cry. only that the mermaids have no tears, and therefore they suffer more. "Oh, were I but 15 years old," said she, "I know that I shall love the world up there and all the people who live in it." At last she reached her 15th year. "Well, now you are grown up," said the old dowager, her grandmother, "so you must let me adorn you like your other sisters." And she placed a wreath of white lilies in her hair, and every flower leaf was half a pearl. Then the old lady ordered 8 great oysters to attach themselves to the tail of the princess to show her high rank. "But they hurt me so," said the little mermaid. "Pride must suffer pain," replied the old lady. Oh, how gladly she would have shaken off all this grandeur and laid aside the heavy wreath. The red flowers in her own garden would have suited her much better, but she could not help herself. So she said, "Farewell," and rose as lightly as a bubble to the surface of the water. The sun had just set as she raised her head above the waves, but the clouds were tinted with crimson and gold, and through the glimmering twilight beamed the evening star in all its beauty. The sea was calm, and the air mild and fresh. A large ship with 3 masts lay becalmed on the water, with only 1 sail set, for not a breeze stiffed, and the sailors sat idle on deck or amongst the rigging. There was music and song on board, and as darkness came on, 100 colored lanterns were lighted, as if the flags of all nations waved in the air. The little mermaid swam close to the cabin windows, and now and then, as the waves lifted her up, she could look in through clear glass window panes and see a number of well-dressed people within. Among them was a young prince, the most beautiful of all, with large black eyes. He was 16 years of age, and his birthday was being kept with much rejoicing. The sailors were dancing on deck, but when the prince came out of the cabin, more than 100 rockets rose in the air, making it as bright as day. The little mermaid was so startled that she dived underwater, and when she again stretched out her head, it appeared as if all the stars of heaven were falling around her. She had never seen such fireworks before. Great suns spurted fire about, splendid fireflies flew into the blue air, and everything was reflected in the clear, calm sea beneath. The ship itself was so brightly illuminated that all the people, and even the smallest rope, could be distinctly and plainly seen. And how handsome the young prince looked as he pressed the hands of all present and smiled at them, while the music resounded through the clear night air. It was very late, yet the little mermaid could not take her eyes from the ship or from the beautiful prince. The colored lanterns had been extinguished, no more rockets rose in the air, and the cannon had ceased firing. But the sea became restless, and a moaning, grumbling sound could be heard beneath the waves. Still, the little mermaid remained by the cabin window, rocking up and down on the water, which enabled her to look in. After a while, the sails were quickly unfurled, and the noble ship continued her passage. But soon the waves rose higher, heavy clouds darkened the sky, and lightning appeared in the distance. A dreadful storm was approaching. Once more the sails were reefed, and the great ship pursued her flying course over the raging sea. The waves rose mountains high, as if they would have overtopped the mast. But the ship dived like a swan between them, and then rose again on their lofty, foaming crests. To the little mermaid this appeared pleasant sport, not so to the sailors. At length the ship groaned and creaked. The thick planks gave way under the lashing of the sea as it broke over the deck. The mainmast snapped asunder like a reed. The ship lay over on her side, and the water rushed in. The little mermaid now perceived that the crew were in danger. Even she herself was obliged to be careful to avoid the beams and planks of the wreck which lay scattered on the water. At one moment it was so pitch dark that she could not see a single object, but a flash of lightning revealed the whole scene. She could see everyone who had been on board excepting the prince. When the ship parted, she had seen him sink into the deep waves, and she was glad, for she thought he would now be with her. And then she remembered that human beings could not live in the water, so that when he got down to her father's palace, he would be quite dead. But he must not die. So she swam about among the beams and planks which strewed the surface of the sea, forgetting that they could crush her to pieces. Then she dived deeply under the dark waters, rising and falling with the waves, till at length she managed to reach the young prince, who was fast losing the power of swimming in that stormy sea. His limbs were failing him, his beautiful eyes were closed, and he would have died had not the little mermaid come to his assistance. She held his head above the water and let the waves drift them where they would. In the morning the storm had ceased, but of the ship not a single fragment could be seen. The sun rose up red and glowing from the water, and its beams brought back the hue of health to the prince's cheeks, but his eyes remained closed. The mermaid kissed his high, smooth forehead and stroked back his wet hair. He seemed to her like the marble statue in her little garden, and she kissed him again and wished that he might live. Presently they came in sight of land. She saw lofty blue mountains on which the white snow rested as if a flock of swans were lying upon them. Near the coast were beautiful green forests, and close by stood a large building, whether a church or a convent she could not tell. Orange and citron trees grew in the garden, and before the door stood lofty palms. The sea here formed a little bay, in which the water was quite still, but very deep. So she swam with the handsome prince to the beach, which was covered with fine white sand, and there she laid him in the warm sunshine, taking care to raise his head higher than his body. Then bells sounded in the large white building, and a number of young girls came into the garden. The little mermaid swam out farther from the shore and placed herself between some high rocks that rose out of the water. Then she covered her head and neck with the foam of the sea so that her little face might not be seen, and watched to see what would become of the poor prince. She did not wait long before she saw a young girl approach the spot where he lay. She seemed frightened at first, but only for a moment. Then she fetched a number of people, and the mermaid saw that the prince came to life again and smiled upon those who stood round him. But to her he sent no smile. He knew not that she had saved him. This made her very unhappy. And when he was led away into the great building, she dived down sorrowfully into the water and returned to her father's castle. She had always been silent and thoughtful, and now she was more so than ever. Her sisters asked her what she had seen during her first visit to the surface of the water, but she would tell them nothing. Many an evening and morning did she rise to the place where she had left the prince. She saw the fruits in the garden ripen till they were gathered, the snow on the tops of the mountains melt away. But she never saw the prince, and therefore she returned home, always more sorrowful than before. It was her only comfort to sit in her own little garden and fling her arm round the beautiful marble statue, which was like the prince. But she gave up tending her flowers, and they grew in wild confusion over the paths, twining their long leaves and stems round the branches of the trees, so that the whole place became dark and gloomy. At length she could bear it no longer, and told one of her sisters all about it. Then the others heard the secret, and very soon it became known to two mermaids, whose intimate friend happened to know who the prince was. She had also seen the festival on board ship, and she told them where the prince came from and where his palace stood. "Come, little sister," said the other princesses. Then they entwined their arms and rose up in a long row to the surface of the water, close by the spot where they knew the prince's palace stood. It was built of bright yellow shining stone, with long flights of marble steps, one of which reached quite down to the sea. Splendid gilded cupolas rose over the roof, and between the pillars that surrounded the whole building stood life-like statues of marble. Through the clear crystal of the lofty windows could be seen noble rooms, with costly silk curtains and hangings of tapestry, while the walls were covered with beautiful paintings, which were a pleasure to look at. In the center of the largest saloon, a fountain threw its sparkling jets high up into the glass cupola of the ceiling, through which the sun shone down upon the water and upon the beautiful plants growing round the basin of the fountain. Now that she knew where he lived, she spent many an evening and many a night on the water near the palace. She would swim much nearer the shore than any of the others ventured to do. Indeed, once she went quite up the narrow channel under the marble balcony, which threw a broad shadow on the water. Here she would sit and watch the young prince, who thought himself quite alone in the bright moonlight. She saw him many times of an evening sailing in a pleasant boat with music playing and flags waving. She peeped out from among the green rushes, and if the wind caught her long silvery white veil, those who saw it believed it to be a swan, spreading out its wings. On many a night, too, when the fishermen with their torches were out at sea, she heard them relate so many good things about the doings of the young prince that she was glad she had saved his life when he had been tossed about half dead on the waves. And she remembered that his head had rested on her bosom, and how heartily she had kissed him. But he knew nothing of all this, and could not even dream of her. She grew more and more fond of human beings, and wished more and more to be able to wander about with those whose world seemed to be so much larger than her own. They could fly over the sea in ships, and mount the high hills which were far above the clouds, and the lands they possessed, their woods and their fields, stretched far away beyond the reach of her sight. There was so much that she wished to know, and her sisters were unable to answer all her questions. Then she applied to her old grandmother, who knew all about the upper world, which she very rightly called the lands above the sea. "If human beings are not drowned," asked the little mermaid, "can they live forever? Do they never die as we do here in the sea?" "Yes," replied the old lady. "They must also die, and their term of life is even shorter than ours. We sometimes live to 300 years, but when we cease to exist here, we only become the foam on the surface of the water. And we have not even a grave down here of those we love. We have not immortal souls. We shall never live again. But like the green seaweed, when once it has been cut off, we can never flourish more. Human beings, on the contrary, have a soul which lives forever, lives after the body has been turned to dust. It rises up through the clear, pure air beyond the glittering stars, As we rise out of the water and behold all the land of the earth, so do they rise to unknown and glorious regions which we shall never see." "Why have not we an immortal soul?" asked the little mermaid mournfully. "I would give gladly all the hundreds of years that I have to live, to be a human being only for one day, and to have the hope of knowing the happiness of that glorious world above the stars." "You must not think of that," said the old woman. "We feel ourselves to be much happier and much better off than human beings." "So I shall die," said the little mermaid, "and as the foam of the sea, I shall be driven about never again to hear the music of the waves, or to see the pretty flowers, nor the red sun. Is there anything I can do to win an immortal soul?" "No," said the old woman, "unless a man were to love you so much that you were more to him than his father or mother, and if all his thoughts and all his love were fixed upon you, and the priest placed his right hand in yours, and he promised to be true to you here and hereafter, then his soul would glide into your body, and you would obtain a share in the future happiness of mankind. He would give a soul to you and retain his own as well. But this can never happen. Your fish's tail, which amongst us is considered so beautiful, is thought on earth to be quite ugly. They do not know any better, and they think it necessary to have 2 stout props, which they call legs, in order to be handsome." Then the little mermaid sighed and looked sorrowfully at her fish's tail. "Let us be happy," said the old lady, "and dart and spring about during the 300 years that we have to live, which is really quite long enough. After that we can rest ourselves all the better. This evening we are going to have a court ball. It is one of those splendid sights which we can never see on earth. The walls and the ceiling of the large ballroom were of thick but transparent crystal. May hundreds of colossal shells, some of a deep red, others of a grass green, stood on each side in rows, with blue fire in them, which lighted up the whole saloon and shone through the walls so that the sea was also illuminated. Innumerable fishes, great and small, swam past the crystal walls. On some of them the scales glowed with a purple brilliancy, and on others they shone like silver and gold. Through the halls flowed a broad stream, and in it danced the mermen and the mermaids to the music of their own sweet singing. No one on earth has such a lovely voice as theirs. The little mermaid sang more sweetly than them all. The whole court applauded her with hands and tails, and for a moment her heart felt quite gay, for she knew she had the loveliest voice of any on earth or in the sea. But she soon thought again of the world above her, for she could not forget the charming prince, nor her sorrow that she had not an immortal soul like his. Therefore she crept away silently out of her father's palace, and while everything within was gladness and song, she sat in her own little garden, sorrowful and alone. Then she heard the bugle sounding through the water, and thought, "He is certainly sailing above, he on whom my wishes depend, and in whose hands I should like to place the happiness of my life. I will venture all for him, and to win an immortal soul, while my sisters are dancing in my father's palace, I will go to the sea witch, of whom I have always been so much afraid, but she can give me counsel and help." And then the little mermaid went out from her garden, and took the road to the foaming whirlpools, behind which the sorceress lived. She had never been that way before. Neither flowers nor grass grew there. Nothing but bare, gray, sandy ground stretched out to the whirlpool, where the water, like foaming mill wheels, whirled round everything that it seized, and cast it into the fathomless deep. Through the midst of these crushing whirlpools, the little mermaid was obliged to pass to reach the dominions of the sea witch, and also, for a long distance, the only road lay right across a quantity of warm, bubbling mire, called by the witch her turf moor. Beyond this stood her house, in the center of a strange forest, in which all the trees and flowers were polypi, half animals and half plants. They looked like serpents with 100 heads growing out of the ground. The branches were long, slimy arms, with fingers like flexible worms, moving limb after limb from the root to the top. All that could be reached in the sea they seized upon and held fast so that it never escaped from their clutches. The little mermaid was so alarmed at what she saw that she stood still, and her heart beat with fear, and she was very nearly turning back, but she thought of the prince and of the human soul for which she longed, and her courage returned. She fastened her long, flowing hair round her head so that the polypi might not seize hold of it. She laid her hands together across her bosom, and then she darted forward as a fish shoots through the water between the supple arms and fingers of the ugly polypi, which were stretched out on each side of her. She saw that each held in its grasp something it had seized with its numerous little arms, as if they were iron bands. The white skeletons of human beings who had perished at sea and had sunk down into the deep waters, skeletons of land animals, oars, rudders, and chests of ships were lying tightly grasped by their clinging arms. Even a little mermaid, whom they had caught and strangled. And this seemed the most shocking of all to the little princess. She now came to a space of marshy ground in the wood, where large, fat water snakes were rolling in the mire and showing their ugly, drab-colored bodies. In the midst of this spot stood a house built with the bones of shipwrecked human beings. There sat the sea witch, allowing a toad to eat from her mouth, just as people sometimes feed a canary with a piece of sugar. She called the ugly water snakes her little chickens and allowed them to crawl all over her bosom. "I know what you want," said the sea witch. "It is very stupid of you, but you shall have your way, and it will bring you to sorrow, my pretty princess. You want to get rid of your fish's tail and to have 2 supports instead of it, like human beings on earth, so that the young prince may fall in love with you, and that you may have an immortal soul." And then the witch laughed so loud and disgustingly that the toad and the snakes fell to the ground and lay there wriggling about. "You are but just in time," said the witch, "for after sunrise tomorrow I should not be able to help you till the end of another year. I will prepare a draught for you, with which you must swim to land tomorrow before sunrise, and sit down on the shore and drink it. Your tail will then disappear and shrink up into what mankind calls legs, and you will feel great pain, as if a sword were passing through you. But all who see you will say that you are the prettiest little human being they ever saw. You will still have the same floating gracefulness of movement, and no dancer will ever tread so lightly. But at every step you take, it will feel as if you were treading upon sharp knives, and that the blood must flow. If you will bear all this, I will help you." "Yes, I will," said the little princess in a trembling voice, as she thought of the prince and the immortal soul. "But think again," said the witch, "for when once your shape has become like a human being, you can no more be a mermaid. You will never return through the water to your sisters or to your father's palace again. And if you do not win the love of the prince, so that he is willing to forget his father and mother for your sake, and to love you with his whole soul, and allow the priest to join your hands, that you may be man and wife, then you will never have an immortal soul. The first morning after he marries another, your heart will break, and you will become foam on the crest of the waves. I will do it, said the little mermaid, and she became pale as death. But I must be paid also, said the witch, and it is not a trifle that I ask. You have the sweetest voice of any who dwell here in the depths of the sea, and you believe that you will be able to charm the prince with it also. But this voice you must give to me. The best thing you possess will I have for the price of my draft. My own blood must be mixed with it, that it may be as sharp as a two-edged sword. But if you take away my voice, said the little mermaid, what is left for me? Your beautiful form, your graceful walk, and your expressive eyes. Surely with these you can enchain a man's heart. Well, have you lost your courage? Put out your little tongue that I may cut it off as my payment. Then you shall have the powerful draft. It shall be, said the little mermaid. Then the witch placed her cauldron on the fire to prepare the magic draft. Cleanliness is a good thing, said she, scouring the vessel with snakes, which she had tied together in a large knot. Then she pricked herself in the breast and let the black blood drop into it. The steam that rose formed itself into such horrible shapes that no one could look at them without fear. Every moment the witch threw something else into the vessel, and when it began to boil, the sound was like the weeping of a crocodile. When at last the magic draft was ready, it looked like the clearest water. There it is for you, said the witch. Then she cut off the mermaid's tongue so that she became dumb and would never again speak or sing. If the polypi should seize hold of you as you return through the wood, said the witch, throw over them a few drops of the potion, and their fingers will be torn into 1,000 pieces. But the little mermaid had no occasion to do this, for the polypi sprang back in terror when they caught sight of the glittering draft, which shone in her hand like a twinkling star. So she passed quickly through the wood and the marsh and between the rushing whirlpools. She saw that in her father's palace the torches in the ballroom were extinguished, and all within asleep. But she did not venture to go into them, for now she was dumb and going to leave them forever. She felt as if her heart would break. She stole into the garden, took a flower from the flower beds of each of her sisters, kissed her hand 1,000 times towards the palace, and then rose up through the dark blue waters. The sun had not risen when she came in sight of the prince's palace and approached the beautiful marble steps, but the moon shone clear and bright. Then the little mermaid drank the magic draught, and it seemed as if a two-edged sword went through her delicate body. She fell into a swoon and lay like one dead. When the sun arose and shone over the sea, she recovered and felt a sharp pain. But just before her stood the handsome young prince. He fixed his coal-black eyes upon her so earnestly that she cast down her own, and then became aware that her fish's tail was gone, and that she had as pretty a pair of white legs and tiny feet as any little maiden could have. But she had no clothes, so she wrapped herself in her long, thick hair. The prince asked her who she was and where she came from, and she looked at him mildly and sorrowfully with her deep blue eyes. But she could not speak. Every step she took was, as the witch had said it would be. She felt as if treading upon the points of needles or sharp knives, but she bore it willingly and stepped as lightly by the prince's side as a soap bubble, so that he and all who saw her wondered at her graceful, swaying movements. She was very soon arrayed in costly robes of silk and muslin, and was the most beautiful creature in the palace. But she was dumb and could neither speak nor sing. Beautiful female slaves, dressed in silk and gold, stepped forward and sang before the prince and his royal parents. One sang better than all the others, and the prince clapped his hands and smiled at her. This was great sorrow to the little mermaid. She knew how much more sweetly she herself could sing once, and she thought, "Oh, if he could only know that. I have given away my voice forever to be with him." The slaves next performed some pretty fairy-like dances to the sound of beautiful music. Then the little mermaid raised her lovely white arms, stood on the tips of her toes, and glided over the floor and danced as no one yet had been able to dance. At each moment, her beauty became more revealed, and her expressive eyes appealed more directly to the heart than the songs of the slaves. Everyone was enchanted, especially the prince, who called her his little foundling, and she danced again quite readily. To please him, though each time her foot touched the floor, it seemed as if she trod on sharp knives. The prince said she should remain with him, always, and she received permission to sleep at his door on a velvet cushion. He had a page's dress made for her, that she might accompany him on horseback. They rode together through the sweet, scented woods, where the green boughs touched their shoulders, and the little birds sang among the fresh leaves. She climbed with the prince to the tops of high mountains, and although her tender feet bled so that even her steps were marked, she only laughed and followed him till they could see the clouds beneath them, looking like a flock of birds traveling to distant lands. While at the prince's palace, and when all the household were asleep, she would go and sit on the broad marble steps, for it eased her burning feet to bathe them in the cold sea water, and then she thought of all those below in the deep. Once during the night her sisters came up arm in arm, singing sorrowfully as they floated on the water. She beckoned to them, and then they recognized her and told her how she had grieved them. After that, they came to the same place every night, and once she saw in the distance her old grandmother, who had not been to the surface of the sea for many years, and the old sea king, her father, with his crown on his head. They stretched out their hands towards her, but they did not venture so near the land as her sisters did. As the days passed, she loved the prince more fondly, and he loved her as he would love a little child. But it never came into his head to make her his wife. Yet, unless he married her, she could not receive an immortal soul. And, on the morning after his marriage with another, she would dissolve into the foam of the sea. "Do you not love me the best of them all?" the eyes of the little mermaid seemed to say, when he took her in his arms and kissed her fair forehead. "Yes, you are dear to me," said the prince, "for you have the best heart, and you are the most devoted to me. You are like a young maiden whom I once saw, but whom I shall never meet again. I was in a ship that was wrecked, and the waves cast me ashore near a holy temple, where several young maidens performed the service. The youngest of them found me on the shore and saved my life. I saw her but twice, and she is the only one in the world whom I could love. But you are like her, and you have almost driven her image out of my mind. She belongs to the holy temple, and my good fortune has sent you to me instead of her, and we will never part. Ah, he knows not that it was I who saved his life, thought the little mermaid. I carried him over the sea to the wood where the temple stands. I sat beneath the foam and watched till the human beings came to help him. I saw the pretty maiden that he loves better than he loves me. And the mermaid sighed deeply, but she could not shed tears. He says the maiden belongs to the holy temple, therefore she will never return to the world. They will meet no more, while I am by his side and see him every day. I will take care of him and love him and give up my life for his sake. Very soon it was said that the prince must marry, and that the beautiful daughter of a neighboring king would be his wife, for a fine ship was being fitted out. Although the prince gave out that he merely intended to pay a visit to the king, it was generally supposed that he really went to see his daughter. A great company were to go with him. The little mermaid smiled and shook her head. She knew the prince's thoughts better than any of the others. "I must travel," he had said to her. "I must see this beautiful princess. My parents desire it, but they will not oblige me to bring her home as my bride. I cannot love her. She is not like the beautiful maiden in the temple, whom you resemble. If I were forced to choose a bride, I would rather choose you, my dumb foundling, with those expressive eyes." And then he kissed her rosy mouth, played with her long, waving hair, and laid his head on her heart, while she dreamed of human happiness and an immortal soul. "You are not afraid of the sea, my dumb child," said he, as they stood on the deck of the noble ship, which was to carry them to the country of the neighboring king. And then he told her of storm and of calm, of strange fishes in the deep beneath them, and of what the divers had seen there. And she smiled at his descriptions, for she knew better than anyone what wonders were at the bottom of the sea. In the moonlight, when all on board were asleep, excepting the man at the helm, who was steering, she sat on the deck, gazing down through the clear water. She thought she could distinguish her father's castle, and upon it her aged grandmother, with the silver crown on her head, looking through the rushing tide at the keel of the vessel. Then her sisters came up on the waves, and gazed at her mournfully, wringing their white hands. She beckoned to them and smiled, and wanted to tell them how happy and well off she was. But the cabin boy approached, and when her sisters dived down, he thought it was only the foam of the sea which he saw. The next morning, the ship sailed into the harbor of a beautiful town belonging to the king whom the prince was going to visit. The church bells were ringing, and from the high towers sounded a flourish of trumpets, and soldiers, with flying colors and glittering bayonets, lined the rocks through which they passed. Every day was a festival. Balls and entertainments followed one another. But the princess had not yet appeared. People said that she was being brought up and educated in a religious house, where she was learning every royal virtue. At last she came. Then the little mermaid, who was very anxious to see whether she was really beautiful, was obliged to acknowledge that she had never seen a more perfect vision of beauty. Her skin was delicately fair, and beneath her long, dark eyelashes, her laughing blue eyes shone with truth and purity. "It was you," said the prince, "who saved my life when I lay dead on the beach." And he folded his blushing bride in his arms. "Oh, I am too happy," said he to the little mermaid. "My fondest hopes are all fulfilled. You will rejoice at my happiness, for your devotion to me is great and sincere. The little mermaid kissed his hand and felt as if her heart were already broken. His wedding morning would bring death to her, and she would change into the foam of the sea. All the church bells rung, and the heralds rode about the town proclaiming the betrothal. Perfumed oil was burning in costly silver lamps on every altar. The priests waved the censers, while the bride and bridegroom joined their hands and received the blessing of the bishop. The little mermaid, dressed in silk and gold, held up the bride's train. But her ears heard nothing of the festive music, and her eyes saw not the holy ceremony. She thought of the night of death which was coming to her, and of all she had lost in the world. On the same evening, the bride and bridegroom went on board ship. Cannons were roaring, flags waving, and in the center of the ship a costly tent of purple and gold had been erected. It contained elegant couches for the reception of the bridal pair during the night. The ship, with swelling sails and a favorable wind, glided away smoothly and lightly over the calm sea. When it grew dark, a number of colored lamps were lit, and the sailors danced merrily on the deck. The little mermaid could not help thinking of her first rising out of the sea, when she had seen similar festivities and joys. And she joined in the dance, poised herself in the air, as a swallow when he pursues his prey, and all present cheered her with wonder. She had never danced so elegantly before. Her tender feet felt as if cut with sharp knives, but she cared not for it. A sharper pang had pierced through her heart. She knew this was the last evening she should ever see the prince, for whom she had forsaken her kindred and her home. She had given up her beautiful voice and suffered unheard-of pain daily for him, while he knew nothing of it. This was the last evening that she would breathe the same air with him, or gaze on the starry sky and the deep sea. An eternal night without a thought or a dream awaited her. She had no soul, and now she could never win one. All was joy and gaiety on board ship till long after midnight. She laughed and danced with the rest, while the thoughts of death were in her heart. The prince kissed his beautiful bride, while she played with his raven hair, till they went arm in arm to rest in the splendid tent. Then all became still on board the ship. The helmsman, alone awake, stood at the helm. The little mermaid leaned her white arms on the edge of the vessel and looked towards the east for the first blush of morning, for that first ray of dawn that would bring her death. She saw her sisters rising out of the flood. They were as pale as herself, but their long, beautiful hair waved no more in the wind and had been cut off. "We have given our hair to the witch," said they, "to obtain help for you, that you may not die tonight. She has given us a knife. Here it is. See, it is very sharp. Before the sun rises, you must plunge it into the heart of the prince. When the warm blood falls upon your feet, they will grow together again and form into a fish's tail, and you will be once more a mermaid, and return to us to live out your 300 years before you die, and change into the salt sea foam. Haste, then. He or you must die before sunrise. Our old grandmother moans so for you that her white hair is falling off from sorrow, as ours fell under the witch's scissors. Kill the prince and come back. Hasten. Do you not see the first red streaks in the sky? In a few minutes the sun will rise, and you must die." And then they sighed deeply and mournfully, and sank down beneath the waves. The little mermaid drew back the crimson curtain of the tent, and beheld the fair bride with her head resting on the prince's breast. She bent down and kissed his fair brow. then looked at the sky on which the rosy dawn grew brighter and brighter. Then she glanced at the sharp knife and again fixed her eyes on the prince, who whispered the name of his bride in his dreams. She was in his thoughts, and the knife trembled in the hand of the little mermaid. Then she flung it far away from her into the waves. The water turned red where it fell, and the drops that spurted up looked like blood. She cast one more lingering, half-fainting glance at the prince, and then threw herself from the ship into the sea, and thought her body was dissolving into foam. The sun rose above the waves, and his warm rays fell on the cold foam of the little mermaid, who did not feel as if she were dying. She saw the bright sun, and all around her floated hundreds of transparent, beautiful beings. She could see through them the white sails of the ship and the red clouds in the sky. Their speech was melodious, but too ethereal to be heard by mortal ears, as they were also unseen by mortal eyes. The little mermaid perceived that she had a body like theirs, and that she continued to rise higher and higher out of the foam. "Where am I?" asked she, and her voice sounded ethereal, as the voice of those who were with her. No earthly music could imitate it. "Among the daughters of the air," answered one of them. "A mermaid has not an immortal soul, nor can she obtain one unless she wins the love of a human being. On the power of another hangs her eternal destiny. But the daughters of the air, although they do not possess an immortal soul, can, by their good deeds, procure one for themselves. We fly to warm countries and cool the sultry air that destroys mankind with the pestilence. We carry the perfume of the flowers to spread health and restoration. After we have striven for 300 years to all the good in our power, we receive an immortal soul and take part in the happiness of mankind. You, poor little mermaid, have tried with your whole heart to do as we are doing. You have suffered and endured and raised yourself to the spirit world by your good deeds. And now, by striving for 300 years in the same way, you may obtain an immortal soul." The little mermaid lifted her glorified eyes towards the sun and felt them, for the first time, filling with tears. On the ship in which she had left the prince, there were life and noise. She saw him and his beautiful bride searching for her. Sorrowfully they gazed at the pearly foam, as if they knew she had thrown herself into the waves. Unseen, she kissed the forehead of her bride and fanned the prince, and then mounted with the other children of the air to a rosy cloud that floated through the ether. "After 300 years, thus shall we float into the kingdom of heaven," said she, "and we may even get there sooner," whispered one of her companions. "Unseen we can enter the houses of men, where there are children, and for every day on which we find a good child, who is the joy of his parents and deserves their love, our time of probation is shortened. The child does not know, when we fly through the room, that we smile with joy at his good conduct, for we can count 1 year less of our 300 years. But when we see a naughty or a wicked child, we shed tears of sorrow, and for every tear a day is added to our time of trial." The Old Street Lamp. Did you ever hear the story of the old street lamp? It is not remarkably interesting, but for once in a way you may as well listen to it. It was a most respectable old lamp, which had seen many, many years of service, and now was to retire with a pension. It was this evening at its post for the last time, giving light to the street. His feelings were something like those of an old dancer at the theater who is dancing for the last time and knows that on the morrow she will be in her garret, alone and forgotten. The lamp had very great anxiety about the next day, for he knew that he had to appear for the first time at the town hall to be inspected by the mayor and the council, who were to decide if he were fit for further service or not. Whether the lamp was good enough to be used to light the inhabitants of one of the suburbs or in the country at some factory, and if not, it would be sent at once to an iron foundry to be melted down. In this latter case, it might be turned into anything, and he wondered very much whether he would then be able to remember that he had once been a street lamp, and it troubled him exceedingly. Whatever might happen, one thing seemed certain, that he would be separated from the watchman and his wife, whose family he looked upon as his own. The lamp had first been hung up on that very evening that the watchman, then a robust young man, had entered upon the duties of his office. Ah, well, it was a very long time since one became a lamp and the other a watchman. His wife had a little pride in those days. She seldom condescended to glance at the lamp, excepting when she passed by in the evening, never in the daytime. But in later years, when all these, the watchman, the wife, and the lamp, had grown old, she had attended to it, cleaned it, and supplied it with oil. The old people were thoroughly honest. They had never cheated the lamp of a single drop of the oil provided for it. This was the lamp's last night in the street, and tomorrow he must go to the town hall. Two very dark things to think of. No wonder he did not burn brightly. Many other thoughts also passed through his mind. How many persons he had lighted on their way, and how much he had seen. As much, very likely, as the mayor and corporation themselves. None of these thoughts were uttered aloud, however, for he was a good, honorable old lamp who would not willingly do harm to anyone, especially to those in authority. As many things were recalled to his mind, the light would flash up with sudden brightness. He had, at such moments, a conviction that he would be remembered. There was a handsome young man once, thought he. It is certainly a long while ago, but I remember he had a little note written on pink paper with a gold edge. The writing was elegant, evidently a lady's hand. Twice he read it through and kissed it, and then looked up at me with eyes that said quite plainly, "I am the happiest of men." Only he and I know what was written on this, his first letter from his lady-love. Ah, yes, and there was another pair of eyes that I remember. It is really wonderful how the thoughts jump from one thing to another. A funeral passed through the street. A young and beautiful woman lay on a bier, decked with garlands of flowers, and attended by torches, which quite overpowered my light. All along the street stood the people from the houses, in crowds, ready to join the procession. But when the torches had passed from before me, and I could look round, I saw one person, alone, standing, leaning against my post, and weeping. Never shall I forget the sorrowful eyes that looked up at me. These and similar reflections occupied the old street lamp. On this, the last time that his light would shine. The sentry, when he is relieved from his post, knows at least who will succeed him, and may whisper a few words to him. But the lamp did not know his successor, or he could have given him a few hints respecting rain or mist, and could have informed him how far the moon's rays would rest on the pavement, and from which side the wind generally blew, and so on. On the bridge over the canal stood 3 persons, who wished to recommend themselves to the lamp, for they thought he could give the office to whomsoever he chose. The first was a herring's head, which could emit light in the darkness. He remarked that it would be a great saving of oil if they placed him on the lamp-post. Number 2 was a piece of rotten wood, which also shines in the dark. He considered himself descended from an old stem, once the pride of the forest. The third was a glowworm, and how he found his way there the lamp could not imagine. Yet there he was, and could really give light as well as the others. But the rotten wood and the herring's head declared most solemnly, by all they held sacred, that the glowworm only gave light at certain times, and must not be allowed to compete with themselves. The old lamp assured them that not one of them could give sufficient light to fill the position of a street lamp. But they would believe nothing he said, and when they discovered that he had not the power of naming his successor, they said they were very glad to hear it, for the lamp was too old and worn out to make a proper choice. At this moment, the wind came rushing round the corner of the street and through the air holes of the old lamp. "What is this I hear?" said he, "that you are going away tomorrow? Is this evening the last time we shall meet? Then I must present you with a farewell gift. I will blow into your brain, so that in future you shall not only be able to remember all that you have seen or heard in the past, but your light within shall be so bright that you shall be able to understand all that is said or done in your presence." "Oh, that is really a very, very great gift," said the old lamp. "I thank you most heartily. I only hope I shall not be melted down." "That is not likely to happen yet," said the wind. "And I will also blow a memory into you, so that should you receive other similar presents, your old age will pass very pleasantly." "That is if I am not melted down," said the lamp. "But should I in that case still retain my memory?" "Do be reasonable, old lamp," said the wind, puffing away. At this moment the moon burst forth from the clouds. "What will you give the old lamp?" asked the wind. "I can give nothing," she replied. "I am on the wane, and no lamps have ever given me light while I have frequently shone upon them." And with these words the moon hid herself again behind the clouds, that she might be saved from further importunities. Just then a drop fell upon the lamp, from the roof of the house, but the drop explained that he was a gift from those gray clouds, and perhaps the best of all gifts. "I shall penetrate you so thoroughly," he said, "that you will have the power of becoming rusty, and if you wish it, to crumble into dust in one night." But this seemed to the lamp a very shabby present, and the wind thought so too. "Does no one give any more? Will no one give any more?" shouted the breath of the wind as loud as it could. Then a bright falling star came down, leaving a broad, luminous streak behind it. "What was that?" cried the herring's head. "Did not a star fall? I really believe it went into the lamp. Certainly, when such high-born personages try for the office, we may as well say, 'Good night,' and go home." And so they did, all three, while the old lamp threw a wonderfully strong light all around him. "This is a glorious gift," said he. "The bright stars have always been a joy to me, and have always shone more brilliantly than I ever could shine, though I have tried with my whole might. And now they have noticed me, a poor old lamp, and have sent me a gift that will enable me to see clearly everything that I remember, as if it still stood before me, and to be seen by all those who love me. And herein lies the truest pleasure, for joy which we cannot share with others is only half enjoyed." "That sentiment does you honor," said the wind. "But for this purpose, wax lights will be necessary. If these are not lighted in you, your particular faculties will not benefit others in the least. The stars have not thought of this. They suppose that you and every other light must be a wax taper. But I must go down now." So he laid himself to rest. "Wax tapers, indeed," said the lamp. "I have never yet had these, nor is it likely I ever shall. If I could only be sure of not being melted down." The next day. Well, perhaps we had better pass over the next day. The evening had come, and the lamp was resting in a grandfather's chair. And guess where? Why, at the old watchman's house. He had begged as a favor that the mayor and corporation would allow him to keep the street lamp in consideration of his long and faithful service, as he had himself hung it up and lit it on the day he first commenced his duties 24 years ago. He looked upon it almost as his own child. He had no children, so the lamp was given to him. There it lay in the great armchair near to the warm stove. It seemed almost as if it had grown larger, for it appeared quite to fill the chair. The old people sat at their supper, casting friendly glances at the old lamp, whom they would willingly have admitted to a place at the table. It is quite true that they dwelt in a cellar, 2 yards deep in the earth, and they had to cross a stone passage to get to their room. But within it was warm and comfortable, and strips of list had been nailed round the door. The bed and the little window had curtains, and everything looked clean and neat. On the window seat stood 2 curious flower pots, which a sailor named Christian had brought over from the East or West Indies. They were of clay, and in the form of 2 elephants with open backs. They were hollow and filled with earth, and through the open space flowers bloomed. In one grew some very fine chives or leeks. This was the kitchen garden. The other elephant, which contained a beautiful geranium, they called their flower garden. On the wall hung a large colored print representing the Congress of Vienna and all the kings and emperors at once. A clock with heavy weights hung on the wall and went tick, tick, steadily enough. Yet it was always rather too fast, which, however, the old people said was better than being too slow. They were now eating their supper, while the old street lamp, as we have heard, lay in the grandfather's armchair near the stove. It seemed to the lamp as if the whole world had turned round. But after a while, the old watchman looked at the lamp and spoke of what they had both gone through together, in rain and in fog, during the short, bright nights of summer, or in the long winter nights, through the drifting snowstorms, when he longed to be at home in the cellar. Then the lamp felt it was all right again. He saw everything that had happened quite clearly, as if it were passing before him. Surely the wind had given him an excellent gift. The old people were very active and industrious. They were never idle for even a single hour. On Sunday afternoons, they would bring out some books, generally a book of travels, which they were very fond of. The old man would read aloud about Africa, with its great forests and the wild elephants, while his wife would listen attentively, stealing a glance now and then at the clay elephants, which served as flower pots. "I can almost imagine I am seeing it all," she said. And then how the lamp wished for a wax taper to be lighted in him, for then the old woman would have seen the smallest detail as clearly as he did himself. The lofty trees, with their thickly entwined branches, the naked Negroes on horseback, and whole herds of elephants treading down bamboo thickets with their broad, heavy feet. "What is the use of all my capabilities?" sighed the old lamp. When I cannot obtain any wax lights, they have only oil and tallow here, and these will not do. One day, a great heap of wax candle ends found their way into the cellar. The larger pieces were burnt, and the smaller ones the old woman kept for waxing her thread. So there were now candles enough, but it never occurred to anyone to put a little piece in the lamp. Here I am now with my rare powers, thought the lamp. I have faculties within me, but I cannot share them. They do not know that I could cover these white walls with beautiful tapestry, or change them into noble forests, or indeed to anything else they might wish for. The lamp, however, was always kept clean and shining in a corner where it attracted all eyes. Strangers looked upon it as lumber, but the old people did not care for that. They loved the lamp. One day, it was the watchman's birthday. The old woman approached the lamp, smiling to herself, and said, "I will have an illumination today in honor of my old man." And the lamp rattled in his metal frame, for he thought, "Now at last I shall have a light within me." But after all, no wax light was placed in the lamp, but oil as usual. The lamp burned through the whole evening, and began to perceive too clearly that the gift of the stars would remain a hidden treasure all his life. Then he had a dream, for to one with his faculties, dreaming was no difficulty. It appeared to him that the old people were dead, and that he had been taken to the iron foundry to be melted down. It caused him quite as much anxiety as on the day when he had been called upon to appear before the mayor and the council at the town hall. But though he had been endowed with the power of falling into decay from rust when he pleased, he did not make use of it. He was therefore put into the melting furnace and changed into as elegant an iron candlestick as you could wish to see, one intended to hold a wax taper. The candlestick was in the form of an angel holding a nosegay, in the center of which the wax taper was to be placed. It was to stand on a green writing table in a very pleasant room. Many books were scattered about, and splendid paintings hung on the walls. The owner of the room was a poet and a man of intellect. Everything he thought or wrote was pictured around him. Nature showed herself to him sometimes in the dark forests, at others in cheerful meadows where the storks were strutting about, or on the deck of a ship sailing across the foaming sea with the clear blue sky above, or at night the glittering stars. "What powers I possess," said the lamp, awaking from his dream. "I could almost wish to be melted down, but no, that must not be while the old people live. They love me for myself alone. They keep me bright and supply me with oil. I am as well off as the picture of the Congress, in which they take so much pleasure." And from that time he felt at rest in himself, and not more so than such an honorable old lamp really deserved to be. The Swan's Nest. Between the restless waves of the Baltic and the storm-kissed waters of the North Sea, there lies an ancient cradle of white feathers, an old swan's nest, resting upon the green and golden marshlands of the north. There, beneath drifting mists and under skies that never forget the light of dawn, swans were born, proud, pure, and eternal. And from that nest have come those who shall never die in the memory of humankind. In the days when the world was still young and the air smelled of iron and pine, a great flock of swans rose into the blue. They spread their wings like banners of snow and turned toward the south, their plumage flashing like swords in the sun. Across the high Alps they flew, where the air was thin and sharp, and the mountains glittered like frozen waves. At last they came to rest upon the wide green plains near Milan, fertile, sun-warmed, and bright with rivers and vineyards. There they settled, and men called them the Lombards, the swans of the south, who carried with them the northern courage and the cool purity of the snows they had left behind. Another flight turned eastward, their feathers catching the dawn light as they soared above the endless forests and seas. These were the proud and loyal swans who found their resting place in Byzantium, that city of gold and domes, where empires dreamed and kings bent their heads beneath heaven's will. There, beside the emperor's throne, they made their home, guardians of majesty, shields of loyalty. Their wings spread wide above the ruler of men, gleaming like silver in the light of 1,000 candles. And they were named the Varangians, the faithful ones, whose courage stood between the throne and its enemies. Yet not all who came from the northern nest brought comfort. On the shores of France there rose a cry of fear, sharp and desperate as the wail of the wind before a storm. The blood-red light of burning villages glowed beneath the wings of the wild swans that descended from the north. With fire in their eyes and steel in their talons, they came. The Northmen, whose ships were like floating dragons, and whose oars bit the sea with hunger. And the people prayed, "Heaven deliver us from the wrath of the north, from the swans of storm and flame." Across the green fields and cliffs of England, the Danish swan stood proud and bright beside the open shore. Upon his head he bore the crown of 3 kingdoms, and in his grasp was the scepter of gold that ruled over sea and land. His voice rolled like thunder over the isles, and his banner cast a shadow long as the coast itself. On the wild Pomeranian coasts, where the forests met the tide, the heathen bent their knees before the sign of the cross, for the Danish swans had come again, this time not as raiders, but as bearers of faith. The banner of the white Christ waved beside the drawn sword. The swan's wings, once darkened by war, now gleamed with the pale fire of redemption. That was long ago, you say, the ancient times. Yes, the centuries have flown as the swans once flew, yet the nest between the seas remains. And from it, through each age, the world has seen new wings unfold, new songs arise. In later days, when the mists of ignorance hung over the earth and men still groped for truth in the twilight of reason, another swan rose from the old nest. His wings shone with strange and holy light, not the light of battle, nor the light of faith, but the light of knowledge, of stars and heavens. With every beat of his wings, the darkness broke apart. The firmament itself drew nearer to mortal eyes. That swan was Tycho Brahe, who read the language of the stars as if they were written for him alone. Through his eyes, the sky became a mirror of divine order, and men saw that the world was vast beyond imagining, yet ruled by law, by beauty, by the same quiet hand that had shaped the first feather on the first swan. Yes, that was then, you say again. But what of our own time? Listen, the wings have not fallen silent. We have seen swan after swan rise into the blue, each bearing a gift for the world. One let his wings glide over the golden strings of a harp, and the sound flowed northward like sunlight through a frozen forest. Mountains rose higher beneath the melody. Pines whispered again of the old gods and heroes. The spirits of Norway's valleys stirred from their sleep. The songs of ancient days lived anew in that music, and the hearts of men remembered that they, too, had wings. Another swan came and struck his mighty wings upon the marble of the earth. The rock trembled, cracked, and burst, and from within came forth forms of beauty that had waited centuries for the touch of light. They stepped into the day, radiant and free, the children of stone reborn. And the people of many lands lifted up their heads, astonished by these new wonders, for they saw in them not just sculpture, but revelation, the soul of man made visible. A third swan wove threads not of silk or gold, but of thought itself. He spun them from land to land, from ocean to ocean, until the world was bound by an invisible web. Upon those shining cords, words could fly swifter than the wind, bearing love, knowledge, and the news of nations. His song was the song of connection, the heartbeat of the earth made one, and still the nest remains, ancient yet alive. The Lord of Heaven, it is said, has a tender love for that nest between the Baltic and the North Sea. For it is not merely a home of birds, but a symbol of spirit, of courage, endurance, and the strange divine fire that cannot die. When storms gather and black wings of war descend to strike it down, the young swans, untested, unblooded, rise to its defense. They form a circle around their cradle of reeds and wind. Their breasts are pierced, their feathers reddened, yet they do not flee. With wings and claws, they strike against the invaders, and their cries mingle with the roar of thunder. They fight not only for the nest, but for all that it means. The memory of flight, the dream of freedom, the promise that beauty and faith will rise again from ruin. Centuries will pass, empires will crumble into dust, and new ones will grow where old ones stood. The languages of men will change, the cities will fade, and even the stars themselves may wander. But from the northern nest, the swans will still rise, proud, white, and luminous. They will fly across oceans of time, and men will see them and remember that they, too, are born of the same air, the same longing for the sky. And one day, far in the future, when the last echoes of battle and the last songs of sorrow have quieted over the earth, there will come a final swan. His wings will gleam with all the light of those who came before him. His voice will hold the memory of every song. He will rise alone into the eternal blue, and the world will look up in wonder. Then, and only then, will it be said in spirit and in truth, "This is the last swan, the last song from the swan's nest." Great-grandfather was the kind of man people remembered even after a single meeting. There was something tender in his eyes, a deep calm in his voice, and an old-fashioned courtesy in every gesture he made. To us, his descendants, he was more than family. He was a bridge to the world that had come before. As far back as I can recall, he had always been father's father and mother's father at once, for he belonged to both sides of the family. Yet when my brother Frederick's little son was born, the title of great-grandfather was bestowed upon him like a medal of honor. He accepted it with a twinkle of pride and a quiet laugh. "That," he said, "is the highest promotion a man can ever hope for in this life." He loved each of us with warmth and patience, but he did not love our age. The old days were the good days, he would often begin, leaning back in his chair, the firelight gleaming in his silver hair. They were quiet and honest and full of meaning. Nowadays, everything is noise and haste. People overturn everything for the sake of novelty. The young give orders to their elders, and even the kings are spoken of as if they were merely common men. Any scoundrel with a scrap of paper can blot the name of an honorable man. When he spoke like that, his cheeks would flush, his eyebrows knit together, and his hand would tremble a little on the armrest. But soon after he would sigh, smile, and soften again. "Ah, well," he would add, "perhaps I am wrong. I belong to another century and cannot quite find a foothold in this one. May God forgive me if I judge too harshly, and may He guide us all toward what is right." Whenever great-grandfather told us stories of the old days, it was as though the air in the room changed. I would sit quietly, my eyes wide, and imagine the centuries peeling away like mist. I saw carriages with gilded wheels rolling down cobbled streets, banners fluttering from guild halls, and processions of craftsmen marching with drums and trumpets. I could almost hear the laughter from Christmas feasts long ago, when men and women in velvet and lace played games of forfeit by candlelight. He did not hide the darker sides of those times. He told us about the rack and the wheel, about kings who tortured and burned, and yet even those horrors seemed wrapped in a strange majesty when he spoke of them. They belonged to an age when courage and cruelty went hand in hand, an age of splendor and suffering. And then he would grow gentler again and tell us of brighter moments, of the day when the Danish nobility freed the peasants, and when the crown prince put an end to the slave trade. Frederick, my eldest brother, would always interrupt him at such moments. "They were barbarous times, great-grandfather," he'd say. "We're better off now. Thank heaven we've left that all behind." It shocked me every time. To contradict great-grandfather seemed almost sacrilegious, but Frederick was fearless with his opinions. He was brilliant too, the pride of our household, already working beside father in the company, and destined to be made partner soon. He had a sharp mind for science and progress, and though great-grandfather often scolded him, I could tell he admired him deeply. They argued constantly, the old world and the new seated across from one another. Yet in some secret way, they needed each other. "The human race grows cleverer," great-grandfather would sigh, "but not kinder. We build faster ships and deadlier weapons, all to destroy what God has made." "That is the price of progress," Frederick would answer. "If men fight, let them fight with precision. The sooner the blood is shed, the sooner peace returns. Efficiency saves lives, not morality." One evening, Frederick told a story that stayed with us all. In a certain small country, he said, the great clock on the town hall kept the time for everyone. It was imperfect, sometimes running fast, sometimes slow, but people still set their days by its chime. Then came the railroads, with their timetables and their fatal precision. At the new station, a clock was installed that matched the sun to the second. Soon everyone followed that one instead, and the mayor's old clock fell silent. I laughed, but great-grandfather did not. He grew thoughtful, even sorrowful. "There is wisdom in that tale," he murmured. "It reminds me of my parents' old Bornholm clock, with its heavy lead weights. It did not always run true, yet it measured out our lives faithfully enough. We trusted its face and never doubted the hands that moved upon it. So it was with government and faith in my youth. People believed in the great clock of society and never questioned its works. But now every wheel, every spring lies exposed behind glass. We study the mechanism, argue over every motion, and lose our peace in the process. That, he said, is the weakness of this age. Too much seeing, too little believing. The two of them would debate far into the night, their voices rising and falling like the ticking of unseen clocks. Then came the day when Frederick was to sail for America. It was for business, but to great-grandfather it felt like exile. "The world is wide," he said softly, holding Frederick's hands, "and so are the hearts of those who love you. But may God carry you safely across that ocean." Frederick laughed. "You shall hear from me every fortnight, and faster still, by telegraph. Time shrinks for those who understand how to use it." And indeed, when he reached England, a telegraph arrived before his letter could even be written. A few days later, another came from New York. "What a divine invention this is," great-grandfather exclaimed, tears glistening in his eyes. "Truly, the Lord has blessed our age with wonders." He kissed me on the forehead when I proudly repeated what Frederick had told me, that the principle of the telegraph had been discovered first in our own country. "Yes," he said, "and I once met the man whose eyes first saw that truth, eyes as bright and innocent as yours." I shook his hand. A month later came another letter. Frederick was engaged to a young lady, lovely and kind. He enclosed her photograph, a marvel in itself. We gathered around it in awe, examining her face with a magnifying glass. "How lifelike she seems," great-grandfather whispered. "Now I shall know her when she enters the room." But the meeting nearly never happened. Their ship, bound for Copenhagen, was caught in a violent storm off the coast of Jutland. The waves were monstrous, the night without stars. Yet from the shore, rescuers fired rockets that carried ropes to the stranded vessel. One by one, the passengers were brought to safety in the lifebuoy, Frederick's bride among them. By dawn, every soul was saved. We were still asleep in Copenhagen when it happened. Only at breakfast did rumors of the wreck reach us. Our hearts froze with fear. And then, within the hour, a telegram arrived. Safe, both of us, home soon. Tears ran down great-grandfather's cheeks. That very day, he donated $200 toward the monument of Hans Christian Ørsted, the man who had unveiled the laws that made the telegraph possible. "For once," Frederick said when he returned with his wife, "old times and new agree." And great-grandfather smiled, resting his trembling hands upon theirs. "Yes," he whispered, "may the old clock and the new one keep time together for a little while longer." Vänö and Glänö, near the wind-swept coast of Zealand, not far from the stately Holsteinborg castle, there once lay two small wooded islands, Vänö and Glänö. Each island bore its own villages, quaint farmhouses, modest churches, and fields where the farmers worked from dawn to dusk. They were close to the mainland, and even closer to one another, as if the sea had only parted them by a narrow channel of water. In those days, travelers and fishermen alike would often speak of the islands as twin siblings, bound together by tides and time. Today, however, only one of these cherished islands remains, and the memory of the other has become like a dream half-remembered. One fateful night, a tempest of unprecedented fury arose. The wind tore across the waters with the rage of 1,000 storms, and the ocean climbed higher than anyone could recall in living memory. Waves crashed and roared as if the world itself were being torn asunder. The air carried the clamor of destruction. It seemed as though the heavens had opened and the earth groaned beneath the fury. Even the church bells, which once rang only to call the faithful to prayer, began to swing wildly in their towers and peal without the touch of human hands. And so it was that Vänö vanished that night, swallowed by the ocean as if it had never been more than a figment of the imagination. Yet those who had spent their lives along the coast knew that it was not truly gone. On many a quiet summer night, when the waters lay calm and low, and the fisherman rowed gently in his boat to catch eel by the torchlight, he could catch a glimpse of Vänö far below the surface. There it lay, submerged but intact, with its white church tower and the tall, solemn walls of its little church, as though it were waiting patiently for the day it might rise again. The old saying, "Vänö is waiting to take Glänö," was recalled as he peered into the depths. And sometimes, when the water was especially still, he thought he could hear the bells tolling. But in truth, it was the clamor of wild swans that had gathered upon the hidden island, their voices carrying across the water in tones that eerily resembled the distant peal of a church bell. There remained, for many years, a number of elderly folk on Glänö who remembered that storm with vivid clarity. They recalled riding across the shallow channel between the islands at ebb tide, their small carts or wagons carrying them safely, while the water reached only the middles of the wheels. It was as natural then as crossing from the Zealand coast to Glänö is now. And so the phrase, "Vänö is waiting to take Glänö," became more than just a warning. It became a certainty for all the children who lay awake during stormy nights. They would whisper the Lord's Prayer, eyes wide in fear, imagining the moment when the submerged island might call forth its twin. Then, comforted, they would drift into sleep, dreaming sweetly, and awaken to find Glänö still there, the woods and fields intact, the farmhouses still cheerful, the hop gardens heavy with summer's green, the birds singing their morning chorus, and the deer leaping lightly through the meadows. Even the gophers, burrowing deep beneath the soil, could not smell the sea, however far they tunneled. Yet, though life on Glänö continued, its days were, as all things are, numbered. No one could say precisely how many years it would endure, only that, one morning, the island, as it had always been, would cease to exist. Perhaps you yourself once stood along its shores, watching the wild swans resting between Zealand and Glänö, while a small sailboat glided by the wooded shore. Perhaps you, too, had crossed the shallows at low tide, feeling the horses splash through the water as the wagon wheels churned. Then you went your way, journeyed far into the world, and years later returned to find familiar sights changed. Now the woods still surround a broad green meadow, fragrant with hay stacked neatly before the farmhouses, the fields lush and alive. Holsteinborg Castle rises still, its golden spires gleaming, yet no longer close to the edge of the bay. It lies farther inland, distant from the shore it once overlooked. You walk down through the woods, across the fields, and toward the beach, seeking the island of Glänö. But you find no wooded land, no familiar paths. Only the open, shining water stretches before you. You wonder, with a shiver of curiosity, whether Vänö has finally risen from the depths and claimed Glänö, as had been foretold for generations. On what stormy night did it happen, you ask yourself? When did the earth shift, moving Holsteinborg Castle so far from the water's edge? The truth is quieter, simpler, and perhaps even more remarkable than the legend. There was no stormy night that brought destruction, no secret submersion. Instead, human skill, patience, and industry shaped the fate of the land. A dam was built to hold back the sea, the water was drained, and the island of Glänö was bound firmly to Zealand, transformed from a solitary isle into part of the mainland. The bay became a meadow, rich with grass, flowers, and fertile soil. The woods thrived, the farmhouses prospered, and the castle stood steadfast as it always had. It was not Vänö that took Glänö. It was the ingenuity and labor of humankind that claimed the land from the ocean and shaped it for generations to come. So the records declare, and the truth endures. Glänö Island, as a separate floating land, exists no longer. Yet beneath the waters of memory, Vänö still waits, its white church tower glimpsed in the depths, a reminder of the mysteries that lie just beyond the shore and of the stories that continue to rise, like swans above the waves. The Snowdrop. It was the deep heart of winter. The air outside bit like glass, the wind howled with sharp teeth, and the trees stood rigid, armored in frost. Yet behind shuttered windows and tightly closed doors, warmth breathed softly. A fire glowed, the air was heavy with comfort, and dreams rested peacefully within. Beneath that same sheltering stillness of snow, under the frozen skin of the earth, a secret life slept, a small, waiting flower within its bulb, silent, patient, and full of promise. Days passed, nights fell. The snow thickened. The world above grew quiet and pale. Then one gray morning, the heavens opened, and rain descended in heavy drops. They fell upon the snow, trickled through its white layers, and seeped into the soil below. Down they sank until they touched the resting bulb, whispering softly of another world, a world of color, of air, of sound, and sunlight. Before long, a sunbeam, too, made its way through the snow, slender but determined. It reached the dark earth and brushed against the root. Something stirred. "Come in," murmured the flower from within her green chamber. "I cannot," sighed the sunbeam. "The door is locked with frost, and I am not yet strong enough to break it open. Wait for the summer, when my arms are warmer, when I am strong." "When will summer come?" the flower asked, trembling in her dream. Each time a faint beam of light reached her, she asked the same. Yet the summer was still a distant kingdom. The snow clung stubbornly to the fields, and every night a fresh film of ice sealed the lakes. "What a long time it takes," she sighed. "I feel a stirring within me, a restlessness I cannot silence. I must stretch, I must open the door, I must rise to greet the day and nod to the summer. Oh, what joy that meeting shall be." And so she pressed outward. The melting water softened the bulb's thin skin. The sun's touch warmed her, the soil yielded, and her yearning became strength. Slowly, bravely, she rose. She pushed through darkness, through the heavy blanket of snow, until one morning, beneath a fragile veil of white, she bloomed. A pale, greenish bud upon a slender stalk, guarded by narrow leaves that clasped her as though in prayer. The snow chilled her, but the sunbeam pierced through it like a friend returning from afar. "Welcome, welcome," sang the golden light, and the flower lifted herself into the brighter world above. The air quivered with song. The sunbeams kissed her white petals, traced the green lines upon her dress, and she bent her head in gratitude and joy. "Beautiful flower," whispered the light. "So pure, so delicate. You are the first, the herald of our reign. You are the bell that rings out the coming of summer. Soon the cold will retreat, the fields will grow green, and roses and lilacs will awaken beside you. But you are the first, the brave one. You are the soul of spring. The flower glowed beneath such praise. The air shimmered around her, even the light seemed to sing. She stood slender and small, yet radiant, clothed in white and hope. For a moment, it seemed the world had turned to summer already, but clouds gathered. The wind grew cruel again. "You have come too soon," muttered the storm. "We still rule here. You should have stayed asleep in your bulb, foolish thing. Now you shall pay for your haste." And winter struck once more. Day after day, no sun appeared. The wind whipped her tender stalk. Frost crawled upon her leaves. It was a time to break the spirit of any fragile thing. Yet the flower did not bow. She was strong in her faith in the summer she had never seen but believed in with her whole being. She remembered the warmth of the sun's voice, the promise hidden in every drop of melted snow. So she stood, trembling yet steadfast, while icy gusts tore around her. "You will die," hissed the wind. "You'll fade, and no one will remember you. The sunbeam only played with you. You are a fool of summer." "A fool of summer," she whispered to herself as dawn broke pale and cold. But that morning, voices came, high, bright, full of wonder. "Oh, look, a snowdrop! How beautiful!" "The first one!" cried a group of children. The flower's heart leapt. Their joy was like sunlight returning. And when small hands plucked her from the earth, she did not feel the pain. She felt only warmth, the warmth of the hand that held her, the breath that whispered admiration. She was carried into a home, placed in clear water, and gazed upon by gentle eyes. To her, it was heaven. It was summer at last. The flower became a gift. A young girl, radiant in white, was to be confirmed that day. She had a dear friend, a student preparing for his own future. With a playful smile, she pressed the delicate blossom between scented paper, on which she had written verses about the summer fool. "Be my winter fool," she wrote teasingly. Folded together, the paper, the poem, and the flower, they traveled through darkness and distance, sealed within a letter. The journey was rough. She was pressed and crushed, but still she dreamed of sunlight. When the letter was opened, the young man's face lit with joy. He kissed the folded page and placed it carefully in a box filled with poems. Yet none of those poems held flowers. She was the first, the only one. And that thought gave her peace. Seasons changed. The flower slept between the pages while time drifted on. When the next summer came, the young man opened the letter again. But now his heart was bitter. The girl had chosen another. He tore the verses apart, flung the letter away. The little snowdrop fell to the floor, pale and flat. But even crushed, she was spared the fire that consumed the paper. The next morning, sunlight found her again. The maid who swept the room lifted her gently and placed her in a book lying open on the table, thinking she had fallen from its pages. There, once more, the snowdrop rested. Between printed verses now, poems of another soul, the songs of Ambrosius Stubb, the old Danish poet. Years passed, the book gathered dust. Then one day it was opened again. "Why, there's a flower," said the reader. "A snowdrop, a summer fool, a poet's fool. Perhaps placed here with a meaning. poor Ambrosius Stubb. He too was a summer fool. He came before his time, and so he wandered through cold days, a guest from house to house, bright but misplaced, like a flower in a glass of water. Yet he was the first, the only one, the young voice of his age. The man smiled tenderly and placed the flower back into the book. And so the snowdrop rested again, honored now as a symbol of art and courage, a sign that beauty may bloom before its season, that those who dare to rise too early may suffer, yet leave behind a trace of light for those who come after. The flower understood, in her own way, what it meant to be remembered, not for lasting long, but for blooming bravely. That is the story of the snowdrop, the first whisper of spring, the little fool of summer, the heart that believed in the sun. "The will-o'-the-wisps are in town," says the Moor-woman. "There was a man who once knew many stories, but they had slipped away from him. So he said, the story that used to visit him of its own accord no longer came and knocked at his door. And why did it come no longer? It is true enough that for days and years the man had not thought of it, had not expected it to come and knock. And if he had expected it, it would certainly not have come. For without there was war, and within was the care and sorrow that war brings with it. The stork and the swallows came back from their long journey, for they thought of no danger. And behold, when they arrived, the nest was burnt, the habitations of men were burnt, the hedges were all in disorder, and everything seemed gone, and the enemy's horses were stamping in the old graves. Those were hard, gloomy times, but they came to an end. And now they were past and gone. So people said, yet no story came and knocked at the door, or gave any tidings of its presence. I suppose it must be dead, or gone away with many other things, said the man. But the story never dies. And more than a whole year went by, and he longed, oh, so very much, for the story. I wonder if the story will ever come back again and knock. And he remembered it so well in all the various forms in which it had come to him, sometimes young and charming, like spring itself, sometimes as a beautiful maiden, with a wreath of thyme in her hair, and a beechen branch in her hand, and with eyes that gleamed like deep woodland lakes in the bright sunshine. Sometimes it had come to him in the guise of a peddler, and had opened its box and let silver ribbon come fluttering out, with verses and inscriptions of old remembrances. But it was most charming of all when it came as an old grandmother, with silvery hair and such large, sensible eyes. She knew so well how to tell about the oldest times, long before the princesses spun with the golden spindles, and the dragons lay outside the castles guarding them. She told with such an air of truth that black spots danced before the eyes of all who heard her, and the floor became black with human blood. Terrible to see and to hear, and yet so entertaining, because such a long time had passed since it all happened. "Will it ever knock at my door again?" said the man, and he gazed at the door, so that black spots came before his eyes and upon the floor. He did not know if it was blood or morning crepe from the dark, heavy days. And as he sat thus, the thought came upon him whether the story might not have hidden itself, like the princess in the old tale. And he would now go in search of it. If he found it, it would beam in new splendor, lovelier than ever. Who knows? Perhaps it has hidden itself in the straw that balances on the margin of the well. Carefully, carefully. Perhaps it lies hidden in a certain flower. that flower in one of the great books on the bookshelf. And the man went and opened one of the newest books to gain information on this point. But there was no flower to be found. There he read about Holger Danske, and the man read that the tale had been invented and put together by a monk in France, that it was a romance, translated into Danish and printed in that language, that Holger Danske had never really lived, and consequently could never come again, as we have sung, and have been so glad to believe. And William Tell was treated just like Holger Danske. These were all only myths, nothing on which we could depend, and yet it is all written in a very learned book. "Well, I shall believe what I believe," said the man. "There grows no plantain where no foot has trod." And he closed the book and put it back in its place and went to the fresh flowers at the window. Perhaps the story might have hidden itself in the red tulips with the golden yellow edges, or in the fresh rose, or in the beaming camellia. The sunshine lay among the flowers, but no story. The flowers which had been here in the dark, troublous time had been much more beautiful, but they had been cut off, one after another, to be woven into wreaths and placed in coffins, and the flag had waved over them. Perhaps the story had been buried with the flowers, but then the flowers would have known of it, and the coffin would have heard it, and every little blade of grass that shot forth would have told of it. The story never dies. Perhaps it has been here once and has knocked, but who had eyes or ears for it in those times? People looked darkly, gloomily, and almost angrily at the sunshine of spring, at the twittering birds, and all the cheerful green. The tongue could not even bear the old, merry, popular songs, and they were laid in the coffin with so much that our heart held dear. The story may have knocked without obtaining a hearing. There was none to bid it welcome, and so it may have gone away. I will go forth and seek it. Out in the country, out in the wood, and on the open sea beach. Out in the country lies an old manor house, with red walls, pointed gables, and a red flag that floats on the tower. The nightingale sings among the finely fringed beech leaves, looking at the blooming apple trees of the garden, and thinking that they bear roses. Here the bees are mightily busy in the summertime, and hover round their queen with their humming song. The autumn has much to tell of the wild chase, of the leaves of the trees, and of the races of men that are passing away together. The wild swans sing at Christmas time on the open water, while in the old hall the guests by the fireside gladly listen to songs and to old legends. Down into the old part of the garden, where the great avenue of wild chestnut trees lures the wanderer to tread its shades, went the man who was in search of the story. For here the wind had once murmured something to him of Waldemar Daa and his daughters. She, the dryad in the tree, who was the story mother herself, had here told him the dream of the old oak tree. Here, in the time of the ancestral mother, had stood clipped hedges, but now only ferns and stinging nettles grew there, hiding the scattered fragments of old sculptured figures. The moss is growing in their eyes, but they can see as well as ever, which was more than the man could do who was in search of the story, for he could not find that. Where could it be? The crows flew past him by hundreds across the old trees and screamed, "Kra, da, kra, da." And he went out of the garden and over the grass plot of the yard into the alder grove. There stood a little six-sided house with a poultry yard and a duck yard. In the middle of the room sat the old woman who had the management of the whole, and who knew accurately about every egg that was laid, and about every chicken that could creep out of an egg. But she was not the story of which the man was in search, that she could attest with a Christian certificate of baptism and of vaccination that lay in her drawer. Without, not far from the house, is a hill covered with red thorn and broom. Here lies an old gravestone, which was brought here many years ago from the churchyard of the provincial town, a remembrance of one of the most honored counselors of the place. His wife and his 5 daughters, all with folded hands and stiff ruffs, stand round him. One could look at them so long that it had an effect upon the thoughts, and these reacted upon the stones, as if they were telling of old times. At least it had been so with the man who was in search of the story. As he came nearer, he noticed a living butterfly sitting on the forehead of the sculptured counselor. The butterfly flapped its wings and flew a little bit farther, and then returned fatigued to sit upon the gravestone, as if to point out what grew there. 4-leaved shamrocks grew there. There were 7 specimens close to each other. When fortune comes, it comes in a heap. He plucked the shamrocks and put them in his pocket. Fortune is as good as red gold, but a new, charming story would be better still, thought the man, but he could not find it here. And the sun went down, round and large. The meadow was covered with vapor. The Moor-woman was at her brewing. It was evening. He stood alone in his room and looked out upon the sea, over the meadow, over moor and coast. The moon shone bright. A mist was over the meadow, making it look like a great lake. And indeed, it was once so, as the legend tells. And in the moonlight, the eye realizes these myths. Then the man thought of what he had been reading in the town, that William Tell and Holger Danske never really lived, but yet live in popular story. Like the lake yonder, a living evidence for such myths. Yes, Holger Danske will return again. As he stood thus and thought, something beat quite strongly against the window. Was it a bird, a bat, or an owl? Those are not let in, even when they knock. The window flew open of itself, and an old woman looked in at the man. "What's your pleasure?" said he. "Who are you? You're looking in at the first-floor window. Are you standing on a ladder?" "You have a 4-leaved shamrock in your pocket," she replied. "Indeed, you have 7, and one of them is a 6-leaved one." "Who are you?" asked the man again. "The Moor-woman," she replied. "The Moor-woman who brews. I was at it. The bung was in the cask, but one of the little moor-imps pulled it out in his mischief and flung it up into the yard, where it beat against the window, and now the beer's running out of the cask, and that won't do good to anybody." "Pray tell me some more," said the man. "Yes, wait a little," answered the Moor-woman. "I've something else to do just now." And she was gone. The man was going to shut the window, when the woman already stood before him again. "Now it's done," she said, "but I shall have half the beer to brew over again tomorrow, if the weather is suitable." "Well, what have you to ask me? I've come back, for I always keep my word, and you have 7 4-leaved shamrocks in your pocket, and one of them is a 6-leaved one. That inspires respect, for that's an order that grows beside the sandy way, but that everyone does not find. What have you to ask me? Don't stand there like a ridiculous oaf, for I must go back again directly to my bung and my cask." And the man asked about the story, and inquired if the Moor-woman had met it in her journeyings. "By the big brewing vat," exclaimed the woman, "haven't you got stories enough? I really believe that most people have enough of them. Here are other things to take notice of. other things to examine. Even the children have gone beyond that. Give the little boy a cigar and the little girl a new crinoline. They like that much better. To listen to stories. No, indeed, there are more important things to be done here, and other things to notice. What do you mean by that? Asked the man. And what do you know of the world? You don't see anything but frogs and will-o'-the-wisps. Yes, beware of the will-o'-the-wisps, said the Moor-woman. For they're out, they're let loose. That's what we must talk about. Come to me in the moor, where my presence is necessary, and I will tell you all about it. But you must make haste, and come while your 7 4-leaved shamrocks, for which one has 6 leaves, are still fresh, and the moon stands high. And the Moor-woman was gone. It struck 12 in the town, and before the last stroke had died away, the man was out in the yard, out in the garden, and stood in the meadow. The mist had vanished, and the Moor-woman stopped her brewing. You've been a long time coming, said the Moor-woman. Witches get forward faster than men, and I'm glad that I belong to the witch folk. What have you to say to me now? Asked the man. Is it anything about the story? Can you never get beyond asking about that? Retorted the woman. Can you tell me anything about the poetry of the future? Resumed the man. Don't get on your stilts, said the crone, and I'll answer you. You think of nothing but poetry, and only ask about that story, as if she were the lady of the whole troop. She's the oldest of us all, but she takes precedence of the youngest. I know her well. I've been young, too, and she's no chicken now. I was once quite a pretty elf maiden, and have danced in my time with the others in the moonlight, and have heard the nightingale, and have gone into the forest and met the story maiden, who was always to be found out there, running about. Sometimes she took up her night's lodging in a half-blown tulip, or in a field flower. Sometimes she would slip into the church and wrap herself in the mourning crape that hung down from the candles on the altar. You are capitally well informed, said the man. I ought at least to know as much as you, answered the Moor-woman. Stories and poetry? Yes, they're like 2 yards of the same piece of stuff. They can go and lie down where they like, and one can brew all their prattle and have it all the better and cheaper. You shall have it from me for nothing. I have a whole cupboard full of poetry in bottles. It makes essences, and that's the best of it. Bitter and sweet herbs. I have everything that people want of poetry in bottles, so that I can put a little on my handkerchief on holidays to smell. Why, these are wonderful things that you're telling, said the man. You have poetry in bottles? More than you can require, said the woman. I suppose you know the history of the girl who trod on the loaf so that she might not soil her shoes. That has been written and printed too. I told that story myself, said the man. Yes, then you must know it. And you must know also that the girl sank into the earth directly. To the Moor-woman, just as old Bogey's grandmother was paying her morning visit to inspect the brewery. She saw the girl gliding down and asked to have her as a remembrance of her visit, and got her too. While I received a present that's of no use to me, a traveling druggist's shop, a whole cupboard full of poetry in bottles. Grandmother told me where the cupboard was to be placed, and there it's standing still. Just look. You've your 7 4-leaved shamrocks in your pocket, one of which is a 6-leaved one, and so you will be able to see it. And really in the midst of the moor lay something like a great knotted block of alder, and that was the old grandmother's cupboard. The Moor-woman said that this was always open to her and to everyone in the land, if they only knew where the cupboard stood. It could be opened either at the front or at the back, and at every side and corner, a perfect work of art, and yet only an old alder stump in appearance. The poets of all lands, and especially those of our own country, had been arranged here. The spirit of them had been extracted, refined, criticized, and renovated, and then stored up in bottles. With what may be called great aptitude, if it was not genius, the grandmother had taken, as it were, the flavor of this and of that poet, and had added a little devilry, and then corked up the bottles for use during all future times. "Pray let me see," said the man. "Yes, but there are more important things to hear," replied the Moor-woman. "But now we are at the cupboard," said the man. And he looked in. "Here are bottles of all sizes. What is in this one, and what in that one yonder?" "Here is what they call May balm," replied the woman. "I have not tried it myself, but I have not yet told you the more important thing you were to hear. The will-o'-the-wisps in the town. That's of much more consequence than poetry and stories. I ought indeed to hold my tongue, but there must be a necessity, a fate, a something that sticks in my throat and that wants to come out. Take care, you mortals." "I don't understand a word of all this," cried the man. "Be kind enough to seat yourself on that cupboard," she retorted, "but take care you don't fall through and break the bottles. You know what's inside of them. I must tell of the great event. It occurred no longer ago than the day before yesterday. It did not happen earlier. It has now 363 days to run about. I suppose you know how many days there are in a year? And this is what the Moor-woman told. There was a great commotion yesterday out here in the marsh. There was a christening feast. A little will-o'-the-wisp was born here. In fact, 12 of them were born altogether, and they have permission, if they choose to use it, to go abroad among men, and to move about and command among them, just as if they were born mortals. That was a great event in the marsh, and accordingly, all the will-o'-the-wisps, male and female, went dancing like little lights across the moor. There are some of them of the dog species, but those are not worth mentioning. I sat there on the cupboard and had all the 12 little newborn will-o'-the-wisps upon my lap. They shone like glowworms. They already began to hop and increased in size every moment, so that before a quarter of an hour had elapsed, each of them looked just as large as his father or his uncle. Now, it's an old established regulation and favor that when the moon stands just as it did yesterday, and the wind blows just as it blew then, it is allowed and accorded to all will-o'-the-wisps. That is, to all those who are born at that minute of time, to become mortals, and individually to exert their power for the space of 1 year. The will-o'-the-wisp may run about in the country and through the world, if it is not afraid of falling into the sea or of being blown out by a heavy storm. It can enter into a person and speak for him and make all the movements it pleases. The will-o'-the-wisp may take whatever form he likes, of man or woman, and can act in their spirit and in their disguise in such a way that he can effect whatever he wishes to do. But he must manage, in the course of the year, to lead 365 people into a bad way, and in a grand style, too, to lead them away from the right and the truth. And then he reaches the highest point. Such a will-o'-the-wisp can attain to the honor of being a runner before the devil's state coach, and then he'll wear clothes of fiery yellow and breathe forth flames out of his throat. That's enough to make a simple will-o'-the-wisp smack his lips. But there's some danger in this, and a great deal of work for a will-o'-the-wisp who aspires to play so distinguished a part. If the eyes of the man are opened to what he is, and if the man can then blow him away, it's all over with him, and he must come back into the marsh. Or if, before the year is up, the will-o'-the-wisp is seized with a longing to see his family, and so returns to it and gives the matter up, it is over with him likewise, and he can no longer burn clear, and soon becomes extinguished, and cannot be lit up again. And when the year has elapsed, and he has not led 365 people away from the truth and from all that is grand and noble, he is condemned to be imprisoned in decayed wood, and to lie glimmering there without being able to move. And that's the most terrible punishment that can be inflicted on a lively will-o'-the-wisp. Now, all this I know, and all this I told to the 12 little will-o'-the-wisps whom I had on my lap, and who seemed quite crazy with joy. I told them that the safest and most convenient course was to give up the honor and do nothing at all. But the little flames would not agree to this, and already fancied themselves clad in fiery yellow clothes, breathing flames from their throats. "Stay with us," said some of the older ones. "Carry on your sport with mortals," said the others. "The mortals are drying up our meadows. They've taken to draining. What will our successors do?" "We want to flame. We will flame, cried the newborn will-o'-the-wisps. And thus the affair was settled. And now a ball was given, a minute long. It could not well be shorter. The little elf maidens whirled round 3 times with the rest, that they might not appear proud, but they preferred dancing with one another. And now the sponsors' gifts were presented, and presents were thrown them. These presents flew like pebbles across the sea-water. Each of the elf maidens gave a little piece of her veil. "Take that," they said, "and then you'll know the higher dance, the most difficult turns and twists. That is to say, if you should find them necessary. You'll know the proper deportment, and then you can show yourself in the very pick of society." The night raven taught each of the young will-o'-the-wisps to say, "Goo, goo, good," and to say it in the right place, and that's a great gift which brings its own reward. The owl and the stork, but they said it was not worth mentioning, and so we won't mention it. King Waldemar's wild chase was just then rushing over the moor, and when the great lords heard of the festivities that were going on, they sent a couple of handsome dogs, which hunt on the spoor of the wind, as a present. And these might carry 2 or 3 of the will-o'-the-wisps. A couple of old alpas, spirits who occupy themselves with alp-pressing, were also at the feast. And from these, the young will-o'-the-wisps learned the art of slipping through every keyhole, as if the door stood open before them. These alpas offered to carry the youngsters to the town, with which they were well acquainted. They usually rode through the atmosphere on their own back hair, which is fastened into a knot, for they love a hard seat. But now they sat sideways on the wild hunting dogs, took the young will-o'-the-wisps in their laps, who wanted to go into the town to mislead and entice mortals, and whisk, away they were. Now, this is what happened last night. Today the will-o'-the-wisps are in the town and have taken the matter in hand. But where and how? Ah, can you tell me that? Still, I've a lightning conductor in my great toe, and that will always tell me something. "Why, this is a complete story," exclaimed the man. "Yes, but it is only the beginning," replied the woman. "Can you tell me how the will-o'-the-wisps deport themselves, and how they behave, and in what shapes they have aforetime appeared, and led people into crooked paths? I believe, replied the man, that one could tell quite a romance about the will-o'-the-wisps in 12 parts, or better still, one might make quite a popular play of them. You might write that, said the woman, but it's best let alone. Yes, that's better and more agreeable, the man replied, for then we shall escape from the newspapers and not be tied up by them, which is just as uncomfortable as for a will-o'-the-wisp to lie in decaying wood, to have to gleam, and not to be able to stir. I don't care about it either way, cried the woman. Let the rest write, those who can, and those who cannot likewise. I'll grant you an old bung from my cask that will open the cupboard where poetry's kept in bottles, and you may take from that whatever may be wanting. But you, my good man, seem to have blotted your hands sufficiently with ink, and to have come to that age of satiety that you need not be running about every year for stories, especially as there are much more important things to be done. You must have understood what is going on. The will-o'-the-wisp is in town, said the man. I've heard it, and I have understood it. But what do you think I ought to do? I should be thrashed if I were to go to the people and say, look, yonder goes a will-o'-the-wisp in his best clothes. They also go in undress, replied the woman. The will-o'-the-wisp can assume all kinds of forms and appear in every place. He goes into the church, but not for the sake of the service, and perhaps he may enter into one or other of the priests. He speaks in the parliament, not for the benefit of the country, but only for himself. He's an artist with the color pot, as well as in the theater. But when he gets all the power into his own hands, then the pot's empty. I chatter and chatter, but it must come out, what's sticking in my throat, to the disadvantage of my own family. But I must now be the woman that will save a good many people. It is not done with my good will or for the sake of a medal. I do the most insane things I possibly can, and then I tell a poet about it, and thus the whole town gets to know of it directly. The town will not take that to heart, observed the man. That will not disturb a single person, for they will all think I'm only telling them a story if I say, the will-o'-the-wisp is in the town, says the Moor-woman. Take care of yourselves. The bond of friendship. We've recently made a little journey, and already we want to make a longer one. Where? To Sparta, or Mycenae, or Delphi. There are hundreds of places whose names make the heart pound with the love of travel. On horseback, we climb mountain paths, through shrubs and brush. A single traveler looks like a whole caravan. He rides in front with his guide. A pack horse carries luggage, tent, and provisions. A couple of soldiers guard the rear for his protection. No inn with soft beds awaits him at the end of a tiring day's journey. Often the tent is his roof in nature's great wilderness, and the guide cooks him his supper, a pilau of rice, fowl, and curry. Thousands of gnats swarm around the little tent. It is a miserable night, and tomorrow the route will head across swollen streams. Sit tight on your horse, lest you are washed away. What reward is there for these hardships? The greatest, the richest. Nature reveals herself here in all her glory. Every spot is history. Eye and mind alike are delighted. The poet can sing of it, the painter portray it in splendid pictures, but neither can reproduce the air of reality that sinks deep into the soul of the spectator and remains there. The lonely herdsman up on the hills could, perhaps, by the simple story of an event in his life, open your eyes, and with a few words let you behold the land of the Hellenes better than any travel book could do. Let him speak, then, about a custom, a beautiful, peculiar custom. The shepherd in the mountains will tell about it. He calls it the bond of friendship, and relates, "Our house was built of clay, but the doorposts were fluted marble pillars found on the spot where the house was built. The roof almost reached the ground. Now it was black-brown and ugly, but when it was new, it was covered with blooming oleander and fresh laurel branches fetched from beyond the mountains. The walks around our house were narrow. Walls of rock rose steeply up, bare and black in color. On top of them, clouds often hung like white, living beings. I never heard a bird sing here, and never did the men dance here to the sound of the bagpipe. But the place was sacred from olden times. Its very name reminded of that, for it was called Delphi. The dark, solemn mountains were all covered with snow. The brightest, which gleamed in the red evening sun the longest, was Parnassus. The brook close by our house rushed down from it, and was also sacred long ago. Now the donkey makes it muddy with its feet, but the current rolls on and becomes clear again. How well I remember every spot and its deep, sacred solitude. In the middle of the hut, a fire was lit, and when the hot ashes lay high and glowing, the bread was baked in it. If the snow was piled up high round our hut and almost covered it, then my mother seemed to be her brightest. She would hold my head between her hands, kiss my forehead, and sing the songs she never sang at other times, for our masters, the Turks, did not like them. And she sang, "On the summit of Olympus, in the fir-tree forest lived an old stag. Its eyes were heavy with tears. It wept red, yes, and even green and light blue tears. Then a roebuck came by and said, 'What ails you, that you cry so, that you weep red, green, yes, even light blue? Tears?' The stag replied, 'The Turk has entered our city. He has fierce dogs for the hunt, a goodly pack. I will drive them away across the islands,' said the young roebuck. 'I will drive them away across the islands into the deep sea.' But before evening the roebuck was slain, and before nightfall the stag was hunted and killed." When my mother sang this, her eyes became moist, and a tear hung on the long lashes. But she concealed it, and turned our black bread in the ashes. Then I would clench my fists and say, "We'll kill the Turks." But she repeated the words of the song, "I will drive them across the islands into the deep sea." But before evening the roebuck was slain, and before nightfall the stag was hunted and killed. For several days and nights we had been alone in our hut, and then my father came home. I knew he would bring me seashells from the Gulf of Lepanto, or maybe even a sharp, gleaming knife. But this time he brought us a child, a naked little girl, whom he had carried under his sheepskin coat. She was wrapped in a fur, but when this was taken off and she lay in my mother's lap, all that she possessed was 3 silver coins fastened in her dark hair. And father explained to us that the Turks had killed her parents, and told us so much about it that I dreamed about it all night. Father himself had been wounded, and my mother dressed his arm. His wound was deep, and the thick sheepskin was stiff with blood. The little girl was to be my sister. She was so beautiful, with clear, shining eyes. Even my mother's eyes were not gentler than hers. Yes, Anastasia, as they called her, was to be my sister, for her father was united to mine, united in accordance with an old custom we still keep. They had sworn brotherhood in their youth, and had chosen the most beautiful and virtuous girl in the whole country to consecrate their bond of friendship. I had often heard of the queer and beautiful custom, so now the little girl was my sister. She sat in my lap. I brought her flowers and feathers of the field birds. We drank together of the waters of Parnassus and slept head to head beneath the laurel roof of the hut, while many a winter my mother sang of the red, the green, and the light blue tears. But still I didn't understand it was my own countrymen whose thousand-fold sorrows were reflected in those tears. One day, 3 Frankish men came, dressed differently than we were. They had their tents and beds packed on horses, and more than 20 Turks, armed with swords and muskets, accompanied them, for they were friends of the Pasha and carried letters from him. They only came to view our mountains, to climb Parnassus through snow and clouds, and to see the strange, steep black rocks surrounding our hut. There was no room for them inside our home, nor could they stand the smoke rolling along the ceiling and out at the low door. So they pitched their tents in the narrow clearing outside our house, roasted lambs and birds, and drank strong, sweet wine, which the Turks did not dare to drink. When they left, I went with them for some distance, and my little sister hung in a goatskin on my back. One of the Frankish gentlemen had me stand before a rock and sketched me and her, so lifelike as we stood there, so that we looked like one being. I had never thought of it before, but Anastasia and I were really one person. She was always sitting in my lap or hanging on my back in the goatskin, and when I dreamed, she appeared in my dreams. 2 nights later, other men came to our hut, armed with knives and muskets. They were Albanians. "Brave men," said my mother. They stayed only a short while, wrapping tobacco in strips of paper and smoking it. My sister Anastasia sat on the knees of one of them, and when he was gone, she had only 2 silver coins in her hair instead of 3. The oldest of the men talked about which route they should take. He was not sure. "If I spit upward," he said, "it will fall in my face. If I spit downward, it will fall in my beard." But they had to make a choice, so they went, and my father followed them. And soon afterwards we heard the sound of shots. The firing increased. Then soldiers rushed into our hut and took my mother, myself, and Anastasia prisoners. The robbers, they said, had stayed with us, and my father had gone with them. Therefore, we had to be taken away. Soon I saw the robbers' corpses, and I saw my father's corpse too, and I cried myself to sleep. When I awoke, we were in prison, but the cell was no worse than the room in our hut, and they gave me onions to eat and musty wine poured from a tarred sack, but ours at home was no better. I don't know how long we were held prisoners, but many days and nights went by. It was our holy Easter time when we were released. I carried Anastasia on my back, for my mother was ill and could only walk slowly, and it was a long way down to the sea, to the Gulf of Lepanto. We entered a church magnificent, with pictures on a golden background. They were pictures of angels. Oh, so beautiful. But I thought our little Anastasia was just as beautiful. In the center of the floor was a coffin filled with roses. The Lord Christ is symbolized there as a beautiful rose, said my mother. And then the priest chanted, "Christ is risen." Everybody kissed each other. All the people had lighted tapers in their hands. I received one, and so did little Anastasia. The bagpipes played, men danced hand in hand from the church, and the women outside were roasting the Easter lamb. We were invited to share it, and when I sat by the fire, a boy older than I put his arms around my neck, kissed me, and cried, "Christ is risen." Thus we met for the first time, Aftanides and I. My mother could make fishing nets, which gave her a good income here in the bay. So for a long time, we lived beside the sea. The beautiful sea that tasted like tears, and whose colors reminded me of the song of the weeping stag, for its waters were sometimes red, sometimes green, and then again light blue. Aftanides knew how to guide a boat, and I often sat in it with Anastasia while it glided through the water like a cloud over the sky. Then, as the sun set and the mountains turned a deeper and deeper blue, one range seemed to rise behind the other, and behind all of them was Parnassus, covered with snow. Its summit gleamed in the evening rays like glowing iron, and it seemed as though the light shone from within it. For long after the sun had set, the mountain top still glittered in the clear, blue, shimmering air. The white seabirds touched the water's surface with their wings, and indeed everything here was as calm as among the black rocks at Delphi. I was lying on my back in the boat while Anastasia leaned against my chest, and the stars above shone more brightly than our church lamps. They were the same stars, and they were in exactly the same position above me as when I had sat outside our hut at Delphi, and at last I imagined I was still there. Then there was a splash in the water, and the boat rocked violently. I cried out loud, for Anastasia had fallen overboard, but just as quickly Aftanides had leaped in after her, and soon he lifted her up to me. We undressed her, wrung the water out of her clothes, and then dressed her again. Aftanides did the same for himself. We remained on the water until their clothes were dry, and no one knew about our fright over the little adopted sister, in whose life Aftanides also now had a part. Then it was summer. The sun blazed so fiercely that the leaves on the trees withered. I thought of our cool mountains and their fresh water streams, and my mother longed for them too. So one evening we journeyed home. How quiet it was, and how peaceful. We walked on through the high thyme, still fragrant though the sun had dried its leaves. Not a shepherd did we meet, not a single hut did we pass. Everything was quiet and deserted. Only a shooting star told us that in heaven there still was life. I do not know if the clear blue air glowed with its own light, or if the rays came from the stars, but we could plainly make out the outlines of the mountains. My mother lit a fire and roasted the onions she had brought with her. Then my sister and I slept among the thyme, with no fear of the wolf or the jackal, not to mention fear of the ugly, fire-breathing Smidraki, for my mother sat beside us, and this, I believed, was enough. When we reached our old home, we found the hut a heap of ruins and had to build a new one. A couple of women helped my mother, and in a few days the walls were raised and covered with a new roof of oleander. My mother braided many bottle holsters of bark and skins. I tended the priest's little flock, and Anastasia and the little tortoises were my playmates. One day we had a visit from our dear Aftanides, who said how much he had longed to see us. He stayed with us for 2 whole days. A month later he came again to tell us he was taking a ship for Corfu and Patras, but had to bid us goodbye first. He had brought our mother a large fish. He talked a great deal, not only about the fishermen out in the Gulf of Lepanto, but also of the kings and heroes who had once ruled Greece, just as the Turks rule it now. I have seen a bud on a rose bush develop through the days and weeks into a full, blooming flower before I was even aware how large, beautiful, and blushing it had become. And now I saw the same thing in Anastasia. She was now a beautiful, full-grown girl, and I was a strong youth. I myself had taken from the wolves that fell before my musket the skins that covered my mother's and Anastasia's beds. Years had passed. Then one evening Aftanides returned, strong, brown, and slender as a reed. He kissed us all and had many stories to tell of the great ocean, the fortifications of Malta, and the strange tombs of Egypt. It all sounded wonderful, like a priestly legend, and I looked at him with a kind of awe. "How much you know," I said. "How well you can tell about it. But after all, you once told me about the most wonderful thing," he said. "You told me something that has never been out of my thoughts, the grand old custom of the bond of friendship, a custom I want very much to follow. Brother, let us go to church, as your and Anastasia's fathers did before us. Your sister is the most beautiful and innocent of girls. She shall consecrate us. No nation has such beautiful old customs as we Greeks." Anastasia blushed like a fresh rose, and my mother kissed Aftanides. An hour's walk from our house, where loose earth lies on the rocks and a few scattered trees give shade, stood the little church, a silver lamp hanging before its altar. I wore my best clothes. The white fustanella fell in rich folds over my hips, the red jacket fitted tight and snug, the tassel on my fez was silver, and in my girdle gleamed my knife and pistols. Aftanides wore the blue costume of the Greek sailors. On his chest hung a silver medallion with a figure of the Virgin Mary, and his scarf was as costly as those worn by rich men. Everyone could see that we too were going to some ceremony. We entered the little empty church, where the evening sunlight, streaming through the door, gleamed on the burning lamp and the colored pictures on the golden background. We knelt on the altar steps, and Anastasia stood before us. A long white garment hung loosely and lightly over her graceful figure. On her white neck and bosom, a chain of old and new coins formed a large collar. Her black hair was fastened in a single knot and held together by a small cap fashioned of gold and silver coins that had been found in the old temples. No Greek girl had more beautiful ornaments than she. Her face beamed, and her eyes were bright as two stars. The three of us prayed silently, and then she asked us, "Will you be friends in life and in death?" "Yes," we replied. "Will each of you, whatever may happen, remember, my brother is a part of me. My secrets are his secrets. My happiness is his happiness. Self-sacrifice, patience, every virtue in me belongs to him as well as to me." Then she placed our hands together and kissed each of us on the forehead. And again we prayed silently. Then the priest came through the door behind the altar and blessed the three of us. The singing voices of other holy men sounded from behind the altar screen. The bond of eternal friendship was completed. When we arose, I saw that my mother, standing by the church door, was weeping tenderly. How cheerful it was now in our little hut by the springs of Delphi. The evening before his departure, Aftanides sat with me on the mountainside, his arm around my waist, mine around his neck. We spoke of the suffering of Greece and of the men the country could trust. Every thought of our souls was clear to each of us, and I took his hand. "One thing more you must know, one thing that till this moment only God and I have known. My whole soul is filled with a a love stronger than the love I feel for my mother and for you." "And whom do you love?" asked Aphanides, his face and neck turning red. "I love Anastasia," I said, and then his hand trembled in mine, and he turned pale as a corpse. I saw it and understood, and I also believe my hand trembled. I bent toward him, kissed his brow, and whispered, "I have never told her this. Maybe she doesn't love me. Consider this, brother. I've seen her daily. She has grown up by my side, grown into my soul. And she shall be yours," he said, "yours. I cannot lie to you, nor will I. I love her too, but tomorrow I go. In a year we shall meet again, and then you will be married, won't you? I have some money of my own. It is yours. You must and shall take it." Silently, we wandered across the mountain. It was late in the evening when we stood at my mother's door. She was not there, but as we entered, Anastasia held the lamp up, gazing at Aphanides with a sad and beautiful look. "Tomorrow you're leaving us," she said. "How it saddens me." "Saddens you?" he said, and I thought that in his voice there was a grief as great as my own. I couldn't speak, but he took her hand and said, "Our brother there loves you. Is he dear to you? His silence is the best proof of his love." Anastasia trembled and burst into tears. Then I could see no one but her, think of no one but her. I threw my arms around her and said, "Yes, I love you." She pressed her lips to mine, and her arms slipped around my neck. The lamp had fallen to the ground, and all about us was dark, dark, as in the heart of poor dear Aphanides. Before daybreak, he got up, kissed us all goodbye, and departed. He had given my mother all his money for us. Anastasia was my betrothed, and a few days later, she became my wife. The new century's goddess. The new century's goddess, whom our great-grandchildren or perhaps a still later generation will know, but we shall not. When and how does she reveal herself? What does she look like? What is the theme of her song? Whose heartstrings will she touch? To what heights will she lift her century? Why so many questions? In a busy day like ours, when poetry is very nearly superfluous, when it is agreed that the many immortal productions of today's poets will, in the future, perhaps exist only in the form of charcoal tracings on a prison wall, seen and read only by a few curiosity seekers. Poesy is required to serve in the ranks, at least to accept the challenge in party wars, whether it be blood or ink that flows. But this is only one-sided talk, many will say. Poesy has not been entirely forgotten in our time. No, there are still people who, when they are not busy, are conscious of a desire for poetry, and no sooner do they feel that spiritual rumbling in their respective nobler parts than they promptly go to a bookstore and buy 4 shillings worth of poetry of the most approved styles. Others take much pleasure from whatever they can get at a bargain. They are contented with reading the scrap that is on the grocer's wrapping paper. It is much cheaper, and in our busy time, we must take notice of that. There is demand for whatever is supplied, and that is enough. The poetry of the future, as well as the poetry of music, is reckoned with the Don Quixotiana. To speak of it is much like speaking of a voyage of discovery to Uranus. Time is too short and precious for the mere plays of fantasy. And, to speak seriously for once, what is poetry? These resonant outpourings of feeling and thought, they are only the offspring of nervous vibrations. Enthusiasm, joy, pain, all the movements of the organism, the wise men tell us, are but nerve vibrations. Each of us is but a string instrument, but who touches the strings, who causes them to vibrate into sound. The spirit, the unseen heavenly spirit, who echoes in them his emotion, his feelings. And these are understood by other string instruments, which respond in melting harmonies or clashing dissonances. So it was, and so it will be, in mankind's mighty onward march in the consciousness of freedom. Each century, each 1,000 years, one might even say, has its chief expression in its poetry. Born in the passing era, it comes forth and reigns in the new, succeeding era. Thus she is already born, this goddess of the new century, amid the roar of today's machinery. We send her our greetings. May she hear this, or sometime read it, perhaps among the charcoal tracings we just mentioned. The rocker of her cradle extended from the farthest point reached by the foot of man on polar voyages, as far as the living eye can gaze into the jet depth of the polar sky. We would never hear the rocking for the clatter of engines, the screams of locomotives, the thunder of quarry blasts, and the bursting of the spirit's old bonds. She is born in the vast factory of the present, where steam sets in action its power, and where Master Bloodless and his crew toil night and day. She bears the womanly heart of love, the vestal flame, and the furnace of passion. Hers is the lightning ray of intellect, in all its endless, shifting, prismatic hues of the ages. Fantasy's vast, swan-feathered tunic is her strength and pride. Science wove it. The elemental forces gave it power of wing. On her father's side, she is a child of the people, sound in sense and heart, with an earnest eye and with humor on her lips. Her mother is the high-born, academy-trained emigrant's daughter, with gilded rococo reminiscences. The goddess of the new century has in her the blood and soul of both. Upon her cradle were laid splendid birthday gifts. Plentiful as bonbons, the occult riddles of nature, with their solutions, are strewn there. The diver's bell gives mystic souvenirs from the deep. The map of the heavens, that high-hung Pacific Ocean with its countless isles, each a world in itself, is embroidered on the cradle cloth. The sun paints her pictures. Photography has given her toys to play with. The nurse has sung to her of Eyvind Skaldespiller and Ferdowsi, of the Minnesingers, and what Heine, bold as a boy, sang from his poetic soul. Much, far too much, has the nurse told her. She knows the Edda, the old great-grandmother's frightful tales, where horrors sweep the air with bloody wings. The whole of the Oriental 1001 Nights she heard in the quarter part of an hour. The goddess of the new century is still a child, but she has sprung forth from her cradle and is governed by will, though she still doesn't know what she wants. She is still at play in her vast nursery, packed with treasures of art and the rococo. Greek tragedy and Roman comedy are carved there in marble. The folk songs of the nations cover the walls like withered vines. A kiss from her, and they blossom forth with freshness and sweet vapor. The mighty tones and thoughts of Beethoven, Mozart, Gluck, and the other great masters surround her with eternal chords. On her bookshelves are many laid to rest who in their day were immortal, and there is yet room for many another whose name we hear clicking from the telegraph of immortality, but who dies with the telegram. She has read an awful lot, far too much, for is she not born in our time? And all too much must again be forgotten. But the goddess will know how to forget. She doesn't think of her song, which will flourish in thousands of years to come, beside the legends of Moses and Bidpai's golden fable about the craft and luck of the fox. She doesn't think of her mission or of her melodious future. She is still playing, while the struggles of nations shake the air and sound figures of pen and cannon rush to and fro, runes of mystic reading. She wears a Garibaldi hat, and when she reads her Shakespeare, she stops for a moment to think, "He can still be played when I am grown." Calderon rests in the tomb of his works, beneath the tablet of his glory. The goddess is cosmopolitan, for she has bound together Holberg with Molière, Plautus, and Aristophanes. But most she reads her Molière. She is free from the turbulence that drives the goats of the Alps, but still her soul yearns for the salt of life, as the goats pant for the mountain salt. There is calm in her heart, as in the ancient Hebrew songs, the voice of the nomad drifts over green pastures beneath starry skies. And yet in song, her heart swells mightier than the heart of the inspired warrior from the Thessalonian mountains in the old days of Greece. How goes it with her Christendom? She has learned the ins and outs of philosophy. The elements broke one of her milk teeth, but a new one grew. While yet in the cradle, she ate of the fruit of knowledge and grew wise, so that immortality flashed forth before her as mankind's happiest thought. When begins the new age of poesy? When will the goddess be known? When will she be heard? On a wonderful spring morning, she will come on the locomotive dragon, thundering over bridges and through dark tunnels, or on the back of the puffing dolphin across the calm but surging sea, or high in the air, carried by Montgolfier's bird. Rock, descending in the land where first her God-given voice shall greet the race of man. When? Will she come from the new-found land of Columbus, the land of freedom, where the native is hunted and the African is a beast of burden, the land from where we heard the song of Hiawatha, or from the Antipodes, that golden nugget in the southern sea, the land of opposites, where our nighttime is their daytime, and where the black swans sing in mossy forests. Or maybe from the land where Memnon's pillar rings, but we never understood the song of the Sphinx in the desert from the Isle of the Coal Pit, where since the age of the great Elizabeth, Shakespeare has reigned. Or from Tycho Brahe's home, where he wasn't wanted. Or from California's fairyland, where the redwood holds high its crown as king of the earth's forests. When shall the star be lit, the star on the brow of the goddess, the flower on whose petals is inscribed the century's ideal of beauty in form, color, and fragrance? What is the goddess's new platform? Inquires the skillful politician of the day. What does she stand for? Better ask what she does not stand for. She will not appear as a ghost of bygone times. She will not fashion her dramas from the discarded splendor of the stage, nor cover the lack of dramatic architecture with the dazzling colors of lyric drapery. Her flight forth among us will be as from the car of Thespis to the marble arena. She will not shatter normal human speech to fragments, to be clinked together for an artificial music box with tones from troubadour tournaments. Nor will she separate patrician verse and plain plebeian prose. Twins are they in voice, quality, and power. Nor will she carve from the saga blocks of Iceland and ancient gods, for they are dead. No sympathy or fellowship awaits them in our day. Nor will she command her generation to occupy their thoughts with the fabric of a French novel. Nor will she dull them with the chloroform of everyday history. She will bring the elixir of life. Her song, whether in verse or prose, will be brief, clear, and rich. The nation's heartbeats are but letters in the endless alphabet of mankind's growth. She grasps each letter with equal lovingness, and ranges all in words, and weaves her words into rhythms for her age's hymn. And when shall the hour come? It will be long to us who are still here, brief to those who have flown ahead. The Chinese wall will soon fall. The railways of Europe open old Asia as tightly sealed culture archives, and the opposing streams of human culture meet, mayhap with a thunderous crash. The oldsters of our days will tremble at that sound, and hear in it a judgment, the fall of ancient gods. Forgetting that times and peoples must pass from the earth, and only a tiny image, sealed in a word casket, remain of each, floating like a lotus flower on the stream of eternity, and telling us that all were flesh of our flesh, dressed in different attire. The Jewish image shines radiant from the Bible, the Greek from the Iliad and the Odyssey. And ours? Ask it of the coming goddess at judgment time, when the new heaven is lifted to light and sight at the judgment day. All the power of steam and all the pressure of modern times were levers. Master Bloodless and his busy crew, who seem the all-powerful rulers of our day, are but its servants, black slaves to adorn the festive hall, open its treasures, set its tables, for the great feast day when the goddess, a child of innocence, a maid of inspiration, a matron of calm wisdom, shall lift on high the wonderful lamp of poetry, that rich, full human heart, flaming with the fire of God. Greetings, you goddess of poetry's coming age. May our salutation be heard as is heard the worm's hymn of thanksgiving, the worm that is cut to pieces beneath the plow, while a new springtime is dawning and the plowman draws his furrow among us worms, crushing us, that your blessings may be bestowed upon the coming generation. Greetings, you goddess of the new century. The farmyard cock and the weathercock. In a quiet countryside yard, where the sun gilded every straw and every feather glowed with morning pride, there lived two cocks, one who ruled the dung hill, and another who perched upon the rooftop vane. Each believed himself the truest emblem of greatness. The one on the roof turned with every wind, gazing out over meadows and chimneys, proud of his height. The one on the dung hill strutted among hens and chicks, king of the lowly but adored by all who clucked beneath him. And as fate will have it, they both imagined themselves indispensable. Between their two domains stood a row of planks, a fence not high but proud enough to mark one world from another. Beyond that fence, in the second yard, the air was thick with the smell of earth and straw. Here lay a large cucumber plant, rising from the very heart of the dung hill. Fed by decay, yet reaching for the light, it had grown broad and glossy, and like all creatures born to comfort, it held lofty opinions of its own importance. One is born to greatness, murmured the cucumber to itself. Not every seed may awaken in such rich soil. Some grow wild among stones or drown in puddles, but I am cultivated. See how the sun polishes me, how the dew worships me. The world beyond this fence may be full of feathers and noise, but surely I am the most refined of beings. The cucumber often listened to the sounds of the neighboring yard, the clatter of wings, the cackling of hens, and above all, the clarion call of the yard cock who ruled that small kingdom. To the cucumber, he was a marvel of majesty. How splendidly he crows, it sighed. What rhythm in his step, what fire in his voice. He is the very embodiment of command. That other one, the silent weathercock high upon the roof, what does he know of life? He turns this way and that at the whim of the wind, and never crows a single note of his own. He gleams, yes, but with borrowed light. The true cock is the one below, whose voice shakes the dawn, and whose feathers glisten with the dust of the earth. Oh, if only he would notice me! If he were to devour me, stalk, blossom, and all, I would consider it a glorious ending to live again within so noble a creature. Thus dreamed the cucumber, and thus the day passed. That night the heavens broke open. A storm rolled across the valley, roaring like an army of unseen beasts. Rain lashed the yard, lightning split the clouds, and wind tore at every roof tile and shutter. Hens huddled together, chicks chirped in terror beneath their mother's wings. Even the bold yard cock sought shelter behind the trough. The planks dividing the 2 yards shook, groaned, and finally crashed to the ground, leaving nothing but a heap of splinters between the dung hill and the garden. Yet the weathercock on the roof stood unmoved. Though the wind howled and the rain lashed him till his metal skin shone green with wet, he did not turn, for his axis had rusted fast. He was newly cast, proud of his youth, and already wise in the ways of solitude. Let the tempest rage, he thought. The world below scurries like frightened mice. I remain steadfast, elevated above the folly of feathers and mud. He looked down upon the real birds, the sparrows darting in panic, the swallows twisting through the storm, and he despised them. They were too restless, too common. He respected only the pigeons, whose white wings reminded him vaguely of himself. Though, truth be told, he found even them tiresome. They spoke only of food, of grain and nesting, and their conversation was dull. Once, travelers, storks and wild geese had stopped by his roof, bringing tales of distant lands, of deserts and frozen seas, of thieves and kings. At first he had listened, fascinated, but their stories, he discovered, were always the same. Adventure repeated becomes mere chatter. The world, said the weathercock at last, is an empty echo. Everything repeats itself, everything turns in circles, and all is stupid. He grew more puffed up than ever, filled with a pride that no one could see, which is the most dangerous kind. When dawn came, the storm had passed. The sun peered through the mist, glinting off broken tiles and wet feathers. The planks were gone, and the 2 yards were now 1. The yard cock stepped out proudly, shaking the raindrops from his comb as though they were jewels. "Did you hear my crowing last night?" he demanded of the hens. It pierced the very heart of the storm. True, it lacked a touch of elegance, but strength. Ah, strength makes music of its own. The hens clucked in admiration. They adored him. They always did. One cannot reason with admiration. It clucks whether the song is wise or foolish. The chicks followed close behind, tripping over their tiny feet, eager to imitate every move of their shining hero. When the cock mounted the dung hill, the cucumber trembled with joy. He stood there, radiant in his green pride, and when the cock's beak struck into his tender flesh, he could only whisper, "A happy death! Oh, a happy death!" The hens crowded around, pecking and chattering, for wherever the lord of the yard went, his court followed. "Garden plant," said the cock between mouthfuls, for he liked to show his learning. A creature of the hotbed, a noble vegetable indeed. But he forgot himself in his feast, and the poor cucumber vanished under the strokes of admiration. Then, puffing up his breast, the yard cock turned to his little crowd and proclaimed, "Listen well, hens and chicks, the world shall know of me. I shall crow in such a way that even the distant roofs will echo my song. At my call, chicks will grow into hens in a single day." And he crowed with all his might. The hens fluttered and the chicks squealed with delight. Their hearts swelled with pride. For what greater honor than to belong to such a champion of cocks? When the noise reached the rooftop, even the weathercock heard it. He listened to the boasting below, but did not stir. "A cock that claims he can lay eggs," he muttered, "is no more foolish than a world that believes him. Everything is vanity. He crows. I am silent. He struts in the mud. I rust in solitude. Perhaps I too could lay something, a wind egg, light as air. But why should I? The world does not deserve even that." And with a proud little creak, the weathercock snapped from his post and fell, tumbling from the roof into the mud below. The hens shrieked. They thought he had meant to strike their master dead. But the yard cock merely fluffed his feathers and crowed again. "Let that be a lesson," said he. "Better to crow your own song, even if it's foolish, than to sit puffed up until you break." Moral: better a living pride that crows, even if vain, than a cold pride that stiffens in silence and falls. For the wind forgets both in time, but at least the song is heard before it dies.